Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Edelgard of the Rebellion in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21, Memories of Duskur. I do not care for my own life anymore, Didu intoned. But I will answer your questions nonetheless. Activate silence, Edelgard said, turning back to see that the sound dampening systems on the door activated with a click. It was better for the rest of them not to know what might transpire in the room. If he was indeed Didu, then her identity had to remain secret, and if it was not, she would have to kill the impostor quickly and quietly. Who are you? She asked. I am Didu Molinaro of Duskur, son of Anish and Marin. Prove it. She racked her mind for identifying information, something that would identify him as the Didu that she had once known. Where were you during the tragedy of Duskur? I was protecting my liege and his family, he muttered, eyes still unfocused and staring away. I failed. Something nagged at the back of her mind. Any impersonator who knew his background could come up with that. It was a statement that was undoubtedly true, but vague enough to not be a lie. What was something core to his heart that made up who he really was? Was he still bound by the shackles of chivalry? She would have to ask something that she knew the answer to, and only then would she be satisfied. Then, Edelgard paused and took a breath. What was the promise you made to your liege all those years ago? Didu pulled back, away from the dagger, and straightened himself. He had pulled away a bit too hastily for her liking, but her question was both odd and cut deep. Only now did his eyes lock with hers, as shrouded as they might have been. The conviction that had once been in his eyes many years ago now returned, and at that moment Edelgard knew. I promised him to never throw my life away for his sake, he said. Although it was an empty promise. I would gladly give my life for his sake. I thought I did, until the moment I found myself half dead, bleeding out in a field of my home country. And I knew I would never be able to fulfill that promise. He took a deep breath. Though I suppose that's meaningless to you, Queen of Flames. She sheathed her dagger, now that she had the answer she wanted. Perhaps it is, she said. What happened after the tragedy of Duskur? I found myself bleeding, half dead and aching after the sun had gone down and the night sky took its place. I knew I was going to die. The gaping hole where my stomach had been told me, though from the fact that I did not cough up any blood suggested that there was time left. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I dragged myself, bleeding all the way, to the outskirts of a field. A little boy found me, wandering among the stars above. I still remember his face. It was as if the sky itself had fallen right on top of him. Thinking back, I do not recall what I thought about. Surely my mind was filled with thoughts of tragedy and rage, a desire to save my liege and his family. But in that space between life and death, the moments before I returned to the Earth Mother, the only thing I knew was that I had failed. I awoke to the sound of screaming, and the crackle of flames. I was in a bed of some sorts. Only later did I realize that the little boy had brought me into his family, half-dead stranger that I was. But it was customary to save our own people, and so they fed me and changed my bloody bandages for what had to have been weeks, not knowing if I would live to see another day. I was never able to thank them. Their bodies were at the foot of the staircase as I struggled to walk. In my state I could barely hold a blade, but I knew that if I did not move I would surely die. I could not. Not until I fulfilled the real promise I made in my heart that I would save the young blooded boy I had pledged my life to. I did not know these people, who had given me the gift of life despite never learning my name. I dragged them outside and gave them a proper burial, adorning it with flowers and fruit as were the customs of our people. I never had the chance to thank them properly, and now I never would. In the charred remains of the house I found a woodcutting axe and some money. I was no better than a common thief, and those were the lowest of the low in Duskur. But I had to survive, and I chose to swallow my pride and principles. I silently prayed for forgiveness from the family I had taken from and the Sky King. I wandered for 2 days and 2 nights until I found a city. I did not know where I was until then. Though it was my home country, I was a stranger nonetheless. I had not set foot on my planet in years. And it was then that I learned that the purges of Duskur had begun. There was nothing in that city but rubble and dead bodies. And for the first time in my life, I began to doubt in my gods. I doubted if they had any power at all, if they were to let such atrocities occur to my people. But there must have been a reason that I alone was alive. Perhaps the War Father had plans for me, if the Earth Mother had not taken me yet. If my faith wavered, I could not go on living. And for the sake of my liege I had to live. There were survivors. Ragged tatters of men, women, and children, wandering among the plains of Duskur. I did what I could to help them, and I stayed with those who would not live to see the morning. And just as I had wandered into the city I now left, a ghost among my people. A cracked mirror I saw revealed a man I did not recognize. A beard had grown, and odd bags were underneath my eyes. I was naught but a pile of skin and bones compared to what I once was. I asked everybody and anyone, if they had seen a little boy with straw blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could only be described as, infectious as the word. Nothing. And so I wandered on, beyond the plains of Duskur and into the tattered ruins of my home world. After what seemed to be an eternity, I found my home village, or what was left of it. There was a smoking crater where it had been. I prayed to the gods that my family was safe, but deep down in my heart I knew that they were dead. Mother. Father. Kahiri. Ibrahim. Vena, they could have never escaped. They did not have the money nor the connections. The money I had sent them had barely kept a roof over their heads. And now I did not even have the bodies to bury. There was a nagging in the back of my head to join them. The axe I carried on my back was heavier than it had ever been. But for the sake of my liege and my duty, I continued on, and I pushed that voice into the far corners of my mind. I could not throw my life away. And so I kept searching. All across the planet I saw the same stories, huddles of civilians with nothing to their names, among the charred ashes of the once great planet of Duskur. The only sign of the noble families that had started this in the first place were rumors on loose lips. The closest I ever came to finding them was a manifesto on a freighter headed for Newfoundland, with a cargo. 8 of the Hresvelg children, and a single Bladdid. That confirmed the sensation in my heart that had been growing all of this time. There was nothing left on Duskur but death. I snuck onto one of the last civilian transports leaving the world, among what would be described as the Great Exodus years later. It pained me deeply to leave my homeland once more. Seeing the bright blue and green ball that had once been my home turned to a charred slab of rock did no better to lift my spirits. They must have glassed the planet, perhaps for the sake of terraforming it into a colony with more use. I must have stared at the small window pointing to the last glimpse of my world, until it vanished into a speck that gave way to the darkness of space. Our people were scattered across the colonies. Morphais, Srang, even the fiefdom of Almira. Few dared to step foot on Newfoundland, knowing the risk. And yet some of us did. We were turned away wherever we went, and in those early days some of us were hunted down and killed. We were nothing but filthy Duskurites to them. We had killed their people, and so it meant that we would pay the ultimate price. Any word to the contrary fell on deaf ears. Most of us ended up in abyss, or in questionable living arrangements on the outskirts of the megacity. Some decided to strike it out on the barren wasteland outside the city. I pray that the Earth Mother has not taken them yet. Perhaps they are thriving. For their sake I hope they are. I do not know how many of us there are. Thousands, perhaps. Still, we are exiles from our own land. Refugees. We turned to mercenary work for our money. Many of the men and women in Duskur were trained in the old ways, before hollow blades and hover jets. It was not an honest living, but we managed to support one another. I led a small band with no names. An outsider would call it the Duskur mercenaries, but in reality we were only one small section of many ragtag groups flying the banner of Duskur. I did not know when I became leader. One day I awoke to my men asking me what to do in a time of crisis. Without thinking, I answered them, and soon found the responsibilities of leadership thrust upon me. I had guided them before, and I would guide them one again. But the burden of leadership is that a part of you dies when your men die. There is simply something missing in your soul. I found that out when John died. He was the first. And little by little they died. Each one was another headstone in a sunless world, a forgotten body in a foreign land. Now we were only in the 20s, a far cry from the 50 strong we once were at our peak. There were other cells of course, but we were the largest, and the pitiful reminder of what had once been our great world of Duskur. They were farmers and accountants and electricians and nurses now turned mercenaries. There were no soldiers left from Duskur. Just Duskurites. Edelgard had been looking at him intently as he relayed his story. If that were true, then Duskur was truly no more in both body and spirit. She had heard the rumors, of course, but nobody had dared defy a quarantine zone order. Her family had died that day, along with so many more people. The God Emperor must have signed off on it. Only his word would result in the purging of an entire planet, and for what purpose? Was it merely for the sake of housing an ever-expanding population by exterminating its native people, not 400 years removed from their original home world of Fodlan? Did he eliminate Duskur knowing that despite being a colony it rarely ever provided something of use? Or was it something more? Regardless of the reason, the magistrate had to burn. The Empire had to burn. She had to escalate her timeline. No longer could she carry out attacks here and there, nuisances in the grand scheme of things. She had to do something big. As she thought, something occurred to her. A fear, that perhaps she was throwing in with the wrong lot. The Duskurites had lost. They were a shell of their former selves, content with languishing in mediocrity. Was she wrong to save them? Should she have just left them to rot? Had she wasted her time setting up the whole situation in the first place? She chastised herself for even thinking about that. Dmitri would have slapped me, Edelgard mused. It was merely the right thing to do. Pure pragmatism would get her nowhere. But in careful amounts, however. What happened after? Edelgard asked. She knew the answer, but she wanted to hear it anyway. How were you captured? Dida cleared his throat and continued his story. It was a routine search operation. A mysterious benefactor asked us to locate a missing girl who had been kidnapped by some mysterious assailants, probably the handiwork of a gang in the outskirts of New Fodlan. It reeked of suspicion, but I could not turn down such a sum of money if my people were poor and starving. I took my men and we searched for the girl throughout the streets, combing through every piece of evidence until we found her. Of course we did. Duskurites never failed in their mission. She was in pieces. At the rendezvous point in the tunnels of Abyss we soon found that the entrance had collapsed right as we entered. It was a trap. Enforcers surrounded us, demanding that we lay down our swords or face death. I chose the latter for myself. I do not recall what happened, just that my men escaped at the expense of my capture. Some of them died, I could not see who, and I agonized about which men I had killed with my mistake. Had it been Tahir? Or Michael? Or Jan? I sat in that holding cell for days, ankle irons clasped firmly to my body. Perhaps it was wrong of me to not think of escape. I had been thoroughly defeated. I wished only for my men to live happy lives, far away from the business of death that mercenary work was. We had long been on the magistrate's radar for our blatant disregard for laws. It did not help that we were different from some of the other mercenary groups that had more leeway to operate. We refused to work with the magistrate, because it would spit on the memory of the people. They had been looking for an excuse to finish us off, once and for all. I braced myself for the torture that would follow. We all heard stories about what the magistrate would do to people when they were captured. My men swore they would turn their own blades on themselves before they had a chance to be broken. But my promise to young Dmitri all those years ago still held, and though I had ample opportunity, one stayed my hand. Imagine my surprise when I was marched into a room with enough officers to make a platoon, all encircling me as they spoke to me. I was to be put to death the next morning. The lack of torture was because the magistrate simply did not need it. The Duskurites would be in disarray after my death. Cut off the head of the snake, and the rest would follow. Any other information was inconsequential at best. The horrifying realization that we had amounted to little but a thorn in the side of the magistrate, not even worthy of their attention, truly struck at that moment. I simply put my head down and conceded defeat. I was ready to die. Though I had not found Dmitri or the young Hresvelg scion, no matter how far my intelligence network searched, I would have to die now. I would join my family, and perhaps Master Bladdid in the afterlife. The Earth Mother had been wrong. There was no purpose in allowing me to live, it was only delaying the inevitable. Imagine my surprise when I saw my men hidden among the crowd the day of my own execution. It was all I could to keep a stern face and stare out into the sunset, though my injuries from being beaten still pained me. I cursed themselves for being so foolhardy, for giving up their own lives just so they could save one man. I did not know what they were going to do, but I had an inkling. I had taught my men how to fight, and nothing more. That was all they could do. Then you showed up. I had heard tales of the Queen of Flames, but I dismissed it as fanciful nonsense. The people of Abyss wanted a hero, a savior they could attribute the victories of men toward. Whatever she was, she certainly did not have time to save a Duscurite from certain death. And yet in spite of all that, you did appear. You caused a distraction, and drew their attention away. I must admit that even I found it impressive. The Brigid girl Petra, I believe you called her. She cut my restraints and slung me over her shoulder and simply walked out in the uniform of an enforcer. She blindfolded me, and I wondered if I was merely being sent to be executed once more. That was until I found myself here, in the hideout of the Queen of Flames, and I knew that once more death had eluded me. I did not know why I had been saved, and there was a part of me that did not want to be. Still, I could not blame Tahir and the rest of my men who had put their lives on their line for me. What was done, and so I must fight on. I do not suppose you might be amenable to my cause then, the Queen of Flames said. I do not know you, Dida said. A man of Duscur always remembers his debts. But you did not save me for no reason. Is this why? Did you merely want to press me into your service? A tempting proposition, she replied. But no. I had a duty. Duty to whom? To you. She stood, her red cape flaring out behind her. I promised Dmitri that I would fight for him and all those who had been lost before us. I thought you were dead. And now that you are alive, and it is you, Didu, that I wanted to save today. Not the leader of the Duscur mercenaries. I just needed to make sure. What do you mean by th-? His eyes widened. That's. Edelgard reached for the helmet lock tucked neatly underneath her chin and waited for the fingerprint sensor to engage. With a click the air seal came undone, and she took both of her hands and lifted off of her helmet. She shook the hair out of her suit, platinum locks unfurling as Didu's eyes widened before her. That's impossible, he was at a loss for words of first in her time with him. I am Edelgard von Hresvelg, the only survivor of the Hresvelg family. I carry the burdens of my brother and all that came before him. I am the Queen of Flames. The one who makes miracles. Her voice was steady and firm though she fought a slight quivering in the back of her throat. It's good to see you again, old friend. Lady Hresvelgai, Didu took her left hand. Is it really you? I am not a lady anymore. I am just Edelgard. That is all. She brushed a stray lock of hair away. I searched for you and Master Dmitri for months, for years, and found nothing. How? If you must know, I fought my way through hell and back to be here, she replied. And if you are alive, then that means. She took a heavy sigh. Dima is dead. I am sorry, Didu. He died in my arms. No doubt the man of Duscur had no more tears left to cry, but instead he gravely nodded. I always had hope that perhaps you two were somewhere. I prayed to the Sky King that you had found your own happiness a reason to live. I never imagined it would be like this. His expression was solemn. The years had not been kind on Didu. Ragged scars ran down his face, and he had even grown a bit of a beard. What was once a boy on the cusp of adulthood was now a hardened warrior, and any trace of the soft man he was underneath had been wiped away by years of hardship. Now his features were harsh and stern and she could do little to help. And now you are the Queen of Flames, he shook his head. What would Master Bladdid think of all this, I wonder? I'm doing it for him, she shouted. For all the people that have died beneath their boot, for my little brother. He gently moved to embrace her. It was a warm hug, though she noted that it was a bit more bone-crushing than it had been when she was younger. She was safe now Didu was with her. It would all be okay. Then it is good to see you are doing well. Lady Hresvelg. Perfect. The two of them stormed into the command center to find a rowdy game of poker going between the Duscurites and the Black Eagles. Every head turned to look at them, and immediately some of the more astute members of her team quickly rounded up the cards and shoved them under the console in a vain hope that she would not notice. She chuckled a little to herself. It was still in their nature to be afraid of her. "We have come to an agreement," Edelgard declared. "Like that's all you were doing in there," someone muttered, and there were snickers. She waved the joke aside. "Unlike you, we were discussing our terms." Dida stepped forward. "I have decided to pledge my axe and shield to the Black Eagles. I am grateful for her saving my life, just as I am to all of my men. But it is not just a debt I must repay, it is that we share the same goal, the complete and utter obliteration of the Empire." The Duskurites looked at each other quizzically. But it was Tahir who rose first. "As your lieutenant, I am loath to pledge my loyalty to another. But the Queen of Flames has shown great courage in defending our people. Whether she knows it or not, she has given us hope, something that we have not seen in many years. I shall also offer my sword to your cause, should you accept it." "I shall," Edelgard said. "You are all welcome to make your choices as you see fit. Should you choose another path, neither I nor your leader will hold it against you." "That is a stupid question," said one of the mercenaries, an older woman whose hair had prematurely turned gray from the realities of warfare. "We will gladly follow our leader to the depths into the domain of the Lord of Death if that is what it takes." She stood, and the other Duskurites followed. "We shall pledge ourselves to your cause." "Then that settles it," Didu intoned. "No longer will we have to scrape by, sending our money to our families back home. We shall fight for a purpose. In the name of the land of Duskur, and all those who have died thus far. We, the men of Duskur, accept your invitation to join the Black Eagles of New Fodlan." Well, he didn't have to be so formal about it. But the sentiment was appreciated, old friend. "I hereby accept," Edelgard von Hresvelg said. "Wait just a minute," said Caspar. "What is it?" she asked, concerned. "This calls for a celebration, of course." The Black Eagles that were present began to cheer, and the Duskurites looked at one another. A couple shrugged, and they too began to join in. Somebody threw some paper scraps to substitute for confetti, and the cheers echoed through the subway tunnel. Edelgard smiled, though the kind that didn't reach the eyes. The Black Eagles had just doubled in size. They were a bit rowdier than expected. "Come on, Queen, show us what's behind there," someone shouted. "Yeah, do it. Do it, or you'll have to run around abyss naked." She scowled. "I don't plan on doing either of those things." "No need for that," Didu rebuffed. "The secret of her identity is vital for the sake of our operation. I won't tolerate any talk of the contrary." "Not even a peek?" asked Caspar. She let out a small humph and took a swig of another drink. It was lucky that she had developed the face-masking prototype in a way that it didn't cover her mouth. A downside of her augmentations was that her metabolism ended up being too fast to properly get drunk, so though she could down a few bottles of tequila all by herself, it was pointless considering the most she could do was get tipsy. Still, it greatly amused her to drink with her men. "I'll have to learn some of your names as we go," Edelgard said. "I'm Kamina," a girl chirped, and she saw that it was a girl that looked like she was barely in high school. She had a fair complexion for someone of Duskur, and her hair was neatly cut short into a bob cut. "Hi, Kamina," she replied. "Name's Queen of Flames." There were a couple people who laughed. "Oh come on, you've got to show more humor than that," said Flesh. "I agree," said Monique. "Can you tell us a joke?" There was no way in the Flames of Alel she was telling them a joke. She desperately looked for someone to rescue her. Didu had left to talk with a mixed group of Duskurites and her people about battle strategies and the best way to hold an axe. At least they were mingling well, if that was any comfort to her. Bernadetta was in the middle of being harassed by one of his operators, though she looked like she was comfortable talking about technology in a way that almost seemed like a foreign language. Petra was a few drinks in and babbling about stories from her homeland, and comparing gods in a mix of Fodlani and Brigid. It was a shame she would have to solve her own problems as usual. "I don't think I will." "Oh, so we finally found something that she can't do," said Caspar gleefully. "I knew it," said Flesh. "Did not. Did too." She rolled her eyes and decided to talk to Kamina. You're a bit young to be enlisting, she said. Flesh is just as young as I am, and I don't see you complaining about her, Kamina retorted playfully. She has reason to fight. As do you, I suppose. Randolph Burgleys died before he even had a chance to prove himself. The son of a noble family, he had died in one of the many power struggles between the so-called great families of the empire. It was only by chance that she happened to save the two Burgleys that made up Casper's parents, while Randolph died valiantly defending them from assassins. He left behind a younger sister, who spent the rest of the night cradling the broken body of her brother. Though in the moment she did not show it, she truly felt her pain. She, too, had lost a brother. Flesh pledged herself alongside her uncle, that made her laugh, to the cause of the Queen of Flames, though her young age made her a bit of a bother. The two had been at each other's throats ever since. What a lovely family dynamic. What Casper didn't need to know about his niece was that she was Edelgard's shadow in the darkness. Petra had been quite good at assassinations back when she had gone solo, but her accent and distinct Brigid heritage often made her stand out in the crowd. Flesh had been a wonderful student, and in some ways she surpassed her master. Though Petra was still the better fighter, it was her secret protégé that could blend in effortlessly in a crowd and strike without hesitation. Many of the Queen of Flames' enemies fell to one of her daggers, or poisoned wine, or in one case an unfortunate gas leak. She had always sensed a bloodthirst in the young girl, and this was her way of channeling that energy into something more productive. Still, Edelgard made sure to use her sparingly. She was no older than 19, and yet she had the eyes and posture of a trained killer. She could not bear to corrupt her any more than she already had, and when Edelgard found her giggling after a successful mission, she wondered if she had made a mistake choosing her as her shadow. Of course I do, Kamina snorted. My family had nothing. They still have nothing. This was the only way I could repay them for getting me out of that accursed death trap of a home world. Some respect would be due, said an older woman. Do not speak of Duskur like that. Oh, piss off, Nawa. I barely remember the damn place anyway. Is it true, asked one of her men Allahs, if her memory served her correctly. Has Duskur really been? Yes, said the woman known as Nawa. There is nothing left. Even though they announced the quarantine zone, I still had hope that perhaps, he muttered. Perhaps they wouldn't have been so cruel. I should have known better. I do miss its rolling plains and the Soritan mountain range, Nawa said. The cities, the skies, the flowers. But that's all in the past. You're right, though, admitted Kamina. I shouldn't be talking about the grave of our people like that. I did not mean to put you on the spot, she replied, ruffling the young girl's hair. But Duskur is not just a place. It's in the heart. In our people. And that is why we fight. There was raucous laughter, and Edelgard whipped her head to turn around. Tahir had lost a game of bridge to Petra, and now he would never live it down considering the latter was on the verge of alcohol poisoning. Cards were scattered across the operations floor, and she internally cringed at the thought that they were playing cards where she made life or death decisions. But she supposed that they had to loosen up, so she couldn't help but grin. And this is why you never challenge a royal to a card game, noted Amina dryly. A Brigid royal too, roared someone else, and the laughter continued. Her holodeck buzzed, and she saw a message from Bernadetta asking her to meet in the server room. Edelgard gently excused herself and moved to leave the party before they had time to figure out that she was gone. It was nice to see her men outside of a life-or-death situation. Perhaps she'd liven up the mood with some pranks, or more accurately, have Casper do it since she didn't have a joking bone in her body. A paintball war would be more her style. She stepped into the room to find Bernadetta connecting and replugging some wires. The server room itself was nothing too fancy. Each server had its own independent power system and a backup in case of damage, with its own explosive charges to detonate in the event of capture. There were enough drives here to catalog the entire web, though that had not been necessary, due to Bernadetta's custom file compression system. For now, most of them sat empty, save for when she used it to crawl through the web. Her purple hair, normally a frizzy mess, had at least been done up today into a small bun. She smiled, seeing her operator adjusting to normal human life a bit. If there was one thing the Black Eagles had done, it was making her more comfortable with speaking to people outside of Edelgard. Still, she was hiding away from the party, and that made it a bit messy. "Bernie," Edelgard said, disabling the hollow projector that covered her face and revealing the girl underneath. "What did you call me for?" "Sorry," Bernadetta squeaked. It's just, it was a bit much. But I liked talking to them," she admitted. "The Duskurites are very interesting." "Very interesting indeed," she said wryly. "What's the news?" "You know Governor Lonato, right?" "The former governor, you mean?" "Why, yeah. Well, he's published a manifesto on the magistrate and informally declared war on them." "Huh." She tilted her head in confusion. Lonato had been a staunch supporter of the Empire for years. For things to turn out like this, something must have happened. Dig up what you can on the man. I want to know everything. His family, his history, where he pisses at night." "Pisses?" Her eyes widened. "Okay. Will do, Edel boss. What else is on the docket today? I know it's a bit impromptu, but," she jerked a finger toward the door. "They're kind of using the control room as a party lounge." "Well, that and he's contracted the golden deer apparently." Edelgard audibly groaned. "And you found this through tracing his transactions and cross-referencing it with all known addresses. One hit for a Claude von Regan, or his alias Ricardo. Leave it to Bernadetta to find that out. Not to mention the fact that she did it with a straight face whenever she talked about her work, the stutter somehow vanished. She made note of that for the future. Perhaps it was good that Edelgard worked her so hard. Of all the people for it has to be him, she muttered. You don't like him? Bernadetta asked. She thought of a night of poor decisions in college after a long semester of work, and his sly smirk that angered her to no small extent. She had let her guard down once and she would not do it again. Not with the Regan boy, at least. No, she said firmly. I don't. And that was that. Oh okay, well on other news, the Death Knight has been spotted outside of Abyss. Where? There was a picture taken in Mock District of him, she said. My sensors flagged it. She showed Edelgard her tablet, and her eyes widened. He shouldn't be there. I don't think he should. That explains the spate of disappearances, she mused. Keep an eye on that for now. I'll make sure to investigate that next time we grab a burger there. W.E. Yeah, you. Stop ordering food and go out sometime. But Bernie can't dash. You'll be fine, Edelgard said comfortably, and ruffled her hair. Any last things? After Conan, I checked the security footage that we wrote over. For some reason, the Miklon guy's body just vanished? I'm not sure how, vanished. 1 minute it was there, and the next it wasn't. Great. A phantom body. Knowing her luck, he would come back somehow and try to fight her again, sans Lance of Ruin. And as with anything involving the Ashen Demon, there were more factors at play here. She could not exactly waltz into the tower and demand proof of his death, though she could collect intelligence from the crime scene detectives afterward. That would prove very useful, though how she would do it she did not know. Edelgard rubbed the crease on her forehead. Lovely. That's all, boss. Sorry, I didn't want to pull you out of the celebration for me, but I thought you wanted to know. No. It's all right. She patted Bernadetta on the head before flipping on the hollow projector once more. Let's go rejoin them, shall we? Her mind told a different story though. The last two were concerning, but nothing to concern herself as of the moment. Lord Lonato, though. Lord? She dragged Bernadetta in spite of her protests and walked out to the command room where apparently all of them were waiting for her. 40 pairs of eyes stared at her and her operator. All of them held up some sort of alcohol wine glasses, cans of beer, and even one suspiciously large flask. They raided the wine cabinet, she thought. I'm putting all of them on cleaning duty. The red in their cheeks confirmed that most of them were thoroughly drunk. I was waiting for you to come out, slurred Tahir. To the Queen of Flames. They all raised their glasses and drank. Thank you, said Didu. Without you, I would have been a dead man. You said you would never touch alcohol. What happened? though she supposed that the years had been quite rough on the man, and therefore Edelgard didn't really blame him. Her momentary scowl returned to a genuine smile. "You gave me purpose," said Flesh. "I'm proud to be a Black Eagle." "I had my doubts, but," Amina muttered, "you have my blade." Edelgard reached into the pocket sewn into the lining of her skirt and uncapped a small flask, raising it before the crowd. She offered it to Bernadetta, but she quickly declined. "And to Dusker," she said somberly. "For all those who we have lost, and for all those we have gained today." "To Dusker," the crowd said, and drank once more. The taste of alcohol was bitter on her tongue, but she swallowed nonetheless. She had not expected her men to take so kindly to the new expansion of the Black Eagles, but they seemed to be having a good time. Of course, she would never recruit someone who outwardly expressed their hatred for Duskerites, though she always suspected a few of having less than pleasant tendencies toward them. And now that she had Didu on her side, she would have a formidable ally in her fight against the magistrate. It was a shame that she did not know it was truly him before she tipped off the magistrate to their presence, though knowing her sentimentality, she might have reconsidered her course of action and wasted months of preparation. The girl that they had found was already dead the moment the gangs took hold of her. She simply used it as bait once she found the body. All that was left was for them to take the bait and walk straight into an enforcer ambush that she had carefully set up with her tip. And they played their part beautifully. The initial goal was to scatter the mercenaries and pick up whoever was left, using the promise of revenge for motivation. They were a means to an end. Expanding the Black Eagles meant more disposable muscle for her to use. Didu's presence complicated things. That was the last thing she had been expecting. But with his sacrifice and his rescue, they were now firmly indebted to her beyond simple revenge. It was a matter of honor. And honor was everything to the men and women of Dusker, which was why they were in her hands. Good. Everything was going according to plan. Chapter 22, Love's Labor Lost. Edelgard stepped out onto the balcony and called Bernadetta. The social event inside was sickening. A bunch of nobles and entrepreneurs looking to network and establish connections with one another. She doubted if a single one was there to actually have fun, and she cursed Ingrid for inviting her in the first place. The purple dress she was forced into might have been magnificent if she stared at it in a department store, but now it was nothing more than a cage for her body. Though she was not a prude, all it did was draw unwanted attention to herself, and that was the last thing she needed. She had excused herself to catch a breath after flitting between social groups and making small talk. Nothing caught her ear. For some reason she could not switch the Queen of Flames off and switch the Eisner socialite back on. Edelgard was trapped. All she could do was nod along to the talk of the latest masterpiece from Forticho or the recent consolidation of the Sumeragi conglomerate. If it was not vital to her cause, then she did not care, though the latter might prove to be a problem. Next time, she swore, I'll draw up a list of people I need to talk to. Then maybe I can make something useful of these demmed galas. Hello? B-boss, a meek voice responded. What did you find on Governor Lonato, she asked. I'll send it over right now. The line clicked off. She must have been in a raid call or something for her to leave that fast. She detached her holodeck and switched into tablet mode, folding outwards to create a screen she could hold. On it were the files that Bernadetta had sent over, though most of it was marked up in black ink. The parts that were important were underlined in bright pink, probably the girl's idea of a joke. Edelgard flipped through a few documents. Governor Lonato, retired a few years ago from the position. He graduated top of his class at the Imperial Military Academy. Veteran of the Belt Wars, rising all the way to the rank of colonel. Universally loved by all his men, though there were certain problem spots in his record that Bernadetta identified. Insubordination seems to be a bit of a pattern. She blinked at his last name. Oh. He was a Gaspard. Governor of Gaspard District. Of course he could get away with anything. The position of governor was practically hereditary, and the power of his family extended all the way to the military. Still, that doesn't explain why he turned traitor. Took up the post of governor less than 2 decades ago, and was also loved by his citizens. His approval ratings were in the 80s, something unheard of for a governor. She wrinkled her nose at that. He was either doing something very right, or he was paying off the pollsters, and knowing most nobles, they probably did the latter. passed a basic habeas corpus law within his territory, along with expanding freedom of speech and pushing the boundaries of what the magistrate deemed possible. So he was a bleeding heart who thought that letting the people criticize the government would change anything. And despite all that, his donations to the empire continued. A hypocrite. Gaspard's financials were completely inked out. That irked her. She kept flipping through. He had one biological son, Christophe Gaspard, the heir to the Gaspard family, who served dutifully in the imperial army and rose through the ranks both due to his family name and his competence as a leader. He had reportedly been killed in action, though she knew off the top of her head the dates didn't line up. No major conflict had erupted 3 years ago, and the price of killing a captain of the army would have been a complete massacre. And then there was the death report. He was supposedly killed in combat, and yet his head had been separated from his body prior to the autopsy. The odds of a clean beheading in combat were low, to the point where it was downright suspicious. It seemed more like an execution than an operation gone awry. Was it a court-martial gone wrong? That would have been proper incentive for Governor Lonato to rebel. If his son had turned traitor, then it must have forced him to choose between loyalty to the empire and fatherhood. Had it been a spur-of-the-moment decision, born out of a desire of vengeance? Or had Lonato already been planning to rebel a very long time ago and gotten his own son killed as a result? There were dozens of possibilities for why Lonato chose the path of resistance, but one thing was certain: he had quite the motivation. And sure enough, she flipped to the next page to find that Gaspard's donations stopped soon after the death of his son. There were far too many red flags in his files, Edelgard thought. How had the magistrate not picked up on it until now? Those in charge of compliance and counter-terrorism would most certainly have seen the same signs as she had. She read over his manifesto. I ask you, what is the purpose of the magistrate if not to administer justice? And time again we see the miscarriage of justice, as the organization formed to protect the people has turned against it. What of the tragedy of Duskur, where the magistrate let 2 noble families walk into a death trap and then raised the planet in recompense? And where is the justice in the recent execution of the writer Dumas, whose harsh criticisms of the state were born out of love for what it could be? And of my own son, Christophe Gaspard, who died not an honorable death as they would have you believe, but beheaded by his own people. I was once a pious man, who served his God Emperor with all the fury a man could muster. But I can no longer be blind to the truth. The magistrate serves only themselves. And that is why I call upon the people to take up your arms, and rise up against the oppressors of our land. Edelgard rolled her eyes. Good prose, but she preferred results to inspire the people. As former governor of the district, he was beloved by all and left office with the possibility of climbing higher in the government. But after the death of his son, he had reportedly become reclusive and tended to his other foster children. That was the next page of the dossier. Hubert Gaspard. Adopted at the age of 12, and well-trained due to his education at a merit-based military academy. He withdrew at the age of 20 and returned to manage his adoptive father's affairs after the death of his foster sibling, Christophe. The briefing also noted 2 other children, though their names were blacked out and most likely were not old enough to be in the public eye yet. This was a weakness she could exploit. No doubt he was still reeling after the death of his biological son, and now Ash was the closest thing he had to an heir. And while nobility often looked down on non-hereditary succession, the boy still seemed to be a capable soldier in his own right, and would undoubtedly be fighting along the side of his father. If she could procure information on the other 2 adopted siblings, then she had a fair amount of leverage to use during negotiations. Edelgard would have to tread carefully and determine whether or not Governor Lonato was a worthy ally, or a liability that she needed to take care of. Her thoughts returned to why the magistrate hadn't taken action. There had to be a plan afoot. Something like this would never pass by the yearly compliance and loyalty checks. Perhaps they were waiting to test his loyalty only to find out that he had failed. Or, they were waiting to wipe him and his traitorous rebellion out in one fell swoop, without the need for interrogation or figuring out the other co-conspirators. And they were probably marching on him soon. She switched her holodeck back to handheld mode and placed it back onto her wrist so that she could dial Didu, only for her to be interrupted by a hand on her shoulder. Edelgard whirled around to find herself staring into the eyes of Ingrid, who looked at her with a confused smile. The light of the moon seemed to glimmer off of her modest blue gown, and though she wore barely any makeup she was beautiful by any standards. But it was her smile that showed who she really was. That was the real Ingrid, the friend that she had met through sparring, whose compassion shone through in her actions. Glenn had seemed head over heels for his beautiful fiancée, and Edelgard could see why, albeit with a twinge of sadness on her part. She always made sure everyone was okay at the expense of her own well-being in university. A mother hen, Claude had called her. Still, she had to be on guard. If Ingrid ever caught wind of who Edelgard really was, then there would be hell to pay. She did not know her true feelings on the magistrate were, but considering that her fiancé was an enforcer, it wasn't much of a stretch to say that Edelgard's double life had to be kept a secret. But just for one night, she could relax and be honest. "Edelgard, what are you doing out here?" Ingrid asked. Her voice normally was a bit stern, but now it had a bit of warmth to it. "I needed a break," she replied, which was a partial truth and not an outright lie. "I don't really like parties." "Really?" Ingrid said, tilting her head in a confused manner. "I remember in college the time you got too drunk and—" Edelgard waved her off. "Let's not talk about that." "I thought you liked social galas," she said. "I'm sorry for making you come." No, Edelgard replied. "These people are just a bit much. That's all. I hate having to talk about business and gossip about other people. I don't mind fun, but this isn't exactly fun. It's more of a social obligation." "You really don't have to go to these," Ingrid said. "Everyone knows Edelgard Eisner. No party is gonna change that. I should go to these. It helps my reputation." Ingrid snorted. "You're lucky they think you and I are uptight. If the rumors they spread about poor Dorothea were true, then her parents would faint on the spot." Somewhere in the back of her mind she remembered that Dorothea's parents were very dead, and that Manuela Casagrande had been the closest thing she ever had to a mother. Or that was how the story went. Perhaps her diva friend had been lying. Edelgard kept her mouth shut regardless. "I am not uptight. I seem to recall the look you gave the plover boy after he joked about your breasts, and how you threatened to break his kneecaps with a pool stick. That's just," she spluttered, "that was justified. You'd do the same." "Yeah, I'd break his kneecaps first before telling him." Edelgard chuckled at that. "Not exactly a paragon of virtue, are you, Galatea?" "Humph. I'd duel you for that comment if we were still in university." "No weapons here, but we could arm wrestle?" Edelgard asked jokingly. Ingrid responded to that with an eye roll. "Hilarious, Edelgard. I'm pretty sure the last time we did that will be the only time we ever arm wrestle." "You're just a sore loser," she replied, which prompted a laugh out of the Lancer. "Hey, tell you what," Ingrid said. "Let's go out." "Huh." Edelgard's face flushed slightly. "You're going to be married, idiot." "That's not what I meant." Her face didn't even change a shade, both to her credit and Edelgard's disappointment. "Let's have a girls' night out after this stuffy party. You tell Glenn." "Oh, he's stuck at work today. But he says he wants me to kick back and have some fun, so I think that's a yes." "A very broad definition of a yes. But I'm definitely down," Edelgard said with a smile. "I think causing some trouble is in the cards for tonight." "Yes, let's," Ingrid said. "Dory said she was free after 11, so I'm gonna drag you back into the party by the hem of your dress and we're gonna enjoy ourselves till then." That sounded like the furthest thing she could think of from enjoying themselves. She didn't budge. "Edelgard," her tone was carefully restrained. Edelgard threw up her hands in defeat. "Fine. Let's go. But we're drinking before we go out." This time it was time for Ingrid to grin. "Thought you'd never ask." Ingrid grabbed her hand and yanked her away from the railing and back into the realm of golden chandeliers and fancy tables. People in dress suits and fancy gowns were scattered throughout the room in conversation, and all Edelgard could do was hold on as Ingrid dragged her through the crowd. Though the party was still ongoing, something about it seemed less stuffy than before. Perhaps the time spent reading through Gaspard's file had cleared up her head, though what she had read only served to worry her. Still, she also had to give some credit for her friend being there for her. Ingrid was always good at knowing exactly what to say, and though their conversations were always surface level at best, every time Edelgard came out a little happier than before. Perhaps she'd toast to that. "Hey bartender," Edelgard said. "2 glasses of Gaspard Pinot Noir, please." The bartender, a young man that was about her age, gave her an up-and-down look and nodded. "As you wish, my lady." He quickly grabbed 2 bottles and flipped them upside down over 2 sparkling wine glasses, letting the liquid pour out steadily before grabbing the bottom of the glass and handing both toward the 2 women. "Do try to keep up," Ingrid remarked, grabbing the glass and downing it. "Who are you talking to?" she retorted, knowing full well that she could probably drink her friend under the table. Once again the fiery spirit of competition between the 2 reared its head, and if there was anything Edelgard knew how to do, it was win. Many drinks later, Edelgard found herself standing at the entrance of Mara flanked by her 2 friends. Ingrid was still in the same blue dress as normal, though her face was redder than usual both due to the eerie red lighting of the darkened hallway and the copious amounts of wine she had just consumed. Dorothea, never one to be upstaged, wore a black crop top and a short skirt that made Edelgard blush a little. She felt a bit self-conscious for once in her formal dress that looked like she came straight from a gala, but so long as Ingrid had to suffer through it she would as well. "Good ol' Mara," she muttered, as the entrance to the club loomed ominously before her. Though Newfoundland was filled with nightclubs, only a few commanded the gravitas that Mara did, with a reputation of only letting in minor celebrities and head-turners. On a good night, it was packed full with young men and women ready to dance the night away without a care. Being a Friday night, it certainly was full enough to be problematic, as already she could see the hint of colored smoke and humid air that told her just how packed it was inside there. Her bones shook from the bass of the beat, and if she walked any closer her eardrums might have been blown out. Any hint of conversation or laughter was completely drowned out by the sound of synths and singing. Most of her friends went clubbing as a way to relax. Edelgard, on the other hand, could not even fathom how being in a sweaty crowd without the ability to hear anything could be relaxing. While she enjoyed the feeling of being in a crowd and leaping to the music, she was much more of a ballroom dancer than a freestyle one. Despite all the time she spent teaching Dima how to dance, somehow the same principles didn't carry over to being on the dance floor. All she could do was awkwardly pump her fists in the air and swing around her hips a little as her diva friends danced circles around her. For some reason she felt more at ease in the shady alleyways of Abyss than in the hallways of Mara. There, she at least knew that her strength could keep her safe. Here, though, she couldn't do much without causing a scene. The only comfort was that she was in good hands in the case of Ingrid and Dorothea. She waved to the coat check on the left, who was a scantily clad woman carefully managing a locker of suit jackets and bags for those who needed it. The woman smiled back, and gestured for them to head to the right. The hallway gave way to a large open room with a bar on the left, surrounded by an ocean of people desperately trying to buy drinks or get drinks bought for them. In the center was a massive black dance floor that was filled with even more young people, all dancing their lives away without a care in the world. Hips, hands, and legs moved across the dance floor in a chaotic mess, and Edelgard wrinkled her nose slightly at the sight of a woman throwing her arms around. "Is that what I look like when I dance?" Suddenly a wave of self-awareness washed over her, and Edelgard had the urge to step away from the dance floor for the night. In the back was the DJ for the night, who seemed to be masterfully managing a keyboard and synths with ease. She didn't recognize the song or the artist, but something about it seemed a little familiar. The speakers shook in time with the bass, and from the side of the stage harmless smoke created a haze that made it hard to see through. On the ceilings, lights danced in fixed patterns, giving the whole club a bright glow that diffused through the clouds of smoke. It gave the room an eerie glow of changing colors, dark enough to only catch short glimpses of people but light enough to walk around without squinting. As it fully dawned on her that she would probably be on the dance floor soon enough, Edelgard felt her right hand being grabbed. "Edie, let's go get drinks," Dorothea said, dragging her towards the bar. "Isn't that Ingrid's line?" she replied. "She always sits at the bar the whole time and chats with the bartenders." "She does that?" Dorothea raised an eyebrow at that, seeing that Ingrid was drunkenly making her way toward the bar. "I've never been clubbing with Ingy before. If she catches you calling her that, you're getting skewered." That's only if she catches me, Dorothea said with a wink. Let's go. Her splutters of protest were ignored for the second time in one day, and Edelgard made her way to the bar. She leaned over and thought of her order, which could have been anything as long as they weren't Galatean gushers. She doubted Ingrid would take it too well if she reminded her of Galatea. She settled on a Bloody Reaper with a double shot of gin. The three women grabbed bar stools and sat next to each other, as a way to intimidate any man or woman that dared approach them. Dorothea had already been recognized by a couple adoring fans, and one guy that looked like he was hitting on every woman in the room. Ingrid simply sat and sipped on her vodka cranberry, eyeing the room carefully. You should go dance, Ingrid. It'll be fun. Dorothea suggested. I don't dance, Ingrid muttered. Don't tell me you haven't danced with Glenn before, she said, mildly horrified. Of course I have. Then you can dance here. It's really not the same, said Ingrid with flushed cheeks. I just like going to the club for the ambience. I only dance when there's nobody watching. You didn't complain when I suggested we go clubbing, huffed Dorothea. I'm not complaining. I just want to drink a little more first. Edelgard rolled her eyes, which she noticed she had been doing a lot lately. Of course Dorothea wanted to dance. She was known across the system for both her songs and the dancing that came with it. It was just a matter of whether or not she could drag both of her friends onto the dance floor. What's on your mind, Ingrid? Edelgard asked, leaning toward her friend. You seemed pretty eager to get drunk today. I'm not heek drunk. She snorted. Is it your fiancé? Dorothea asked, with a hint of ice in her voice. If it is, I know where we can hide his body. Dorothea. Edelgard cautioned. What? She shrugged. I wrote a song about that. Don't talk about making her fiancé disappear in front of her. Ingrid simply shook her head as the two bickered. No, it's not Glenn. She took a sip of her drink and leaned her head upwards. I mean, it's not really his fault. It just hit me that I'm going to be married soon. How long have you been engaged? Edelgard asked. The truth, this time. I don't really know when our parents made the arrangement, she muttered. But we only really started talking in high school. That's cute. Dorothea said. So, when did you fall in love? Ingrid's face turned redder than it already was, now matching the color of the red neon sign behind her. The L word was something she never spoke of. There has to be a specific moment. Like, the way he poured tea for you, or the first time you guys dash. Can we not? Ingrid spluttered. Fine, fine. I think I do love him, but I never really had the choice to love him or not. Maybe if I was more rebellious as a teenager, I could have gone against my parents and chosen someone else. But I didn't. Her eyes were glazed over and unfocused, lost in thought as she pondered the meaning of her arranged marriage. And for something I had no choice in, I could have done a lot worse. Do you want to marry him? Edelgard asked cautiously. Yes. That answer came without even the slightest bit of hesitation. Then what are you unsure about? I just wish that it was my own decision to make. Sooner or later I'll be Ingrid Brandel Galatea Frildarius. I'll probably have a couple kids and raise them in a loving family. But I know that I have no control over things. I might never pick up my lance again, and what do I have left if things go south? You could still keep dueling, you know. Edelgard smiled. There's no rule that says once you get married, you can't stay in the circuit. I could, but what's the point of that? Ingrid didn't return the smile. It'll just be more work for Glenn and I, and maybe it's better for me to stop now at the peak of my career than. You'd rather quit than lose. Her silence said everything. I know you want to go out on top, replied Dorothea, brushing her hair absent-mindedly. I know I do. I don't know when I will bow out of the music biz. But I can't let that fear of losing my touch and losing it all stop me from continuing. And it can't control you as well. I hate that I'm scared. I'm afraid of losing, Ingrid whispered. Afraid of losing my skill. My marriage. Afraid of losing Glenn. I'm worried that I might fail, or worse, that I might want to. Edelgard gently clasped her hand, letting the warm feeling of her friend sink in. From the moment the two first crossed blades, it was very clear to Edelgard that her blonde friend was a bit of a sore loser. But it had never gone anywhere other than a momentary pout and a look of abject defeat. Now, though, she was beginning to understand Ingrid a bit more. There was something behind that fear of losing, every time she picked up a lance, a pencil, or even when it came to her own wedding. Perhaps it had something to do with the rumors surrounding the Galatea family. The unspoken rule between them seemed to lift for a moment as she held her friend's hand. Neither would speak about their past, not even when drunk off what seemed like half the vodka in the district of Mach. It was a rule that had kept their friendship going for the last 5 years. And though neither of them dared to make eye contact, the two women came to a silent understanding between them that perhaps, just this night, the veil could be lifted. Perhaps a tiny bit of honesty was due. "I understand how you feel," Edelgard said, still staring pointedly at her drink. "When I lost my brother, the pain wouldn't go away. I wished that I never had a brother at all so that I would never have to feel this way. But then I looked back on all the fond memories we shared together, and the bond that shaped me into who I am today, and I hated myself for even thinking that." Dorothea's mouth was wide open. "Edie, you've never mentioned anything." "I didn't." She dismissed her with a sad nod. "I don't like talking about it. And for a while, I couldn't bear to form another close relationship, whether it was for love or for friendship. I was so afraid of losing someone again, that I shut everyone out of my life." "I'm so sorry, Edelgard," murmured Ingrid hoarsely. "And all this time you've been—" "But I realized something. I couldn't just live in fear of losing the people I love again. What I was doing couldn't be called living without connection, I was simply waiting to die. And so it took a while, but I conquered that fear at university." Her eye was itching for some odd reason, though she found it difficult to shed tears anymore. "That's why I cherished our friendships so much, because to me they meant more than just someone to drag me to clubs and spar with. It meant that I had finally begun to live." Edelgard finally raised her head up and smiled at Ingrid. "Marriage is just another challenge. You've never shied away from a challenge, even if you fear losing. And even if the world crumbled before you, you'd still have us. It's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved. Ingrid chuckled, breaking the somber mood. "Please don't quote poetry, class, Dorothea." She wiped some of the tears that had been on her face with her sleeve and finished her glass. "I know, but you get the idea." "I think you and Glenn will be all right," Dorothea said, wrapping her friend into a hug. "Edelgard, get in here." She obliged, and the three girls huddled into a small group hug. It was a bit awkward considering they were in some questionable outfits, but nonetheless it was the meaning that really mattered. There was a warmth in her heart, different from the feeling she had when she first declared the Black Eagles as the enemy of the Empire. No, this was the feeling of closure, and a heavy weight being lifted off her shoulders. "Thank you, Edelgard, for telling us," Ingrid sniffled. "I'm glad you were able to finally open up about your past." "It feels odd," she said. "But I thought if it could help you, then maybe it'll help me find peace after so many years." "I think it did," Ingrid admitted. "I can't say that I'm not terrified of being a wife, but at least I can sleep a bit more easily tonight. And now I understand a bit more about who Edie really is under there," Dorothea chimed in. "Though as much as I'd like to swap traumatic stories tonight, we came here to have fun, didn't we?" "I forgot about that," muttered Ingrid. "Shall we dance?" asked Edelgard. Her friend frantically looked around for an excuse to leave, only to find a group of women approaching Dorothea in a sprint from the club entrance. It could only be the pop diva's fault, because they were looking right at her and snapping pictures. Their voices were high-pitched and shrill, rising over the thump of the club bass and irking Edelgard to no small degree. "Oh my gosh, is that Dorothea? I love your music. It's so good. Will you marry me?" "On second thought," said Ingrid, turning white, "let's go." Upon seeing the people approaching, Dorothea quickly grabbed the two women and headed right to the dance floor to avoid their gazes, disappearing into the crowd before they had a chance to pursue. They vanished into a sea of drunk young men and women, dancing their little hearts out to the rhythm and the beat of the world around them. Now Edelgard could admit that she was a bit tipsy. The night, or at least part of it, passed by in a blur of black and neon. Multicolored lights shone in the darkness, illuminating those around her as she raised her arms and danced. Well, at least Edelgard tried to dance. She was fairly confident that she looked like a chicken who had just sprouted arms and now awkwardly waved their limbs around to the rhythm. Still, the burning feeling of embarrassment never came, which might have been in part due to her augmentations struggling to keep up with the small bar's worth of alcohol in her system. Edelgard tried to keep track of her friends as she danced and moved with the crowd. Sometimes they were by her side, grabbing her hands and cheering along to the beat. Sometimes they were not, vanishing into the sea of people as Ingrid and Dorothea danced to their own rhythms. But when she did see them, she could not help but admire just how beautiful they were when they danced. Dorothea commanded the room, her movements captivating everyone else on the dance floor. If they did not know who Dorothea Arnold was, they surely knew who she was tonight. The way she moved her hips, her arms, it could be only described as effortlessly sexy. But when they danced together, Edelgard could not help but see the plainclothes enforcers for the club mixed into the crowd, making sure that anybody who dared get too up close and personal got kicked out. She knew her friend hated security, but it was a necessary evil, considering she was a literal superstar. Ingrid's complaints about dancing, as it turned out, were unfounded. Her movements were graceful and natural, and as she stepped to the rhythm and swayed her arms, it was clear that she knew what she was doing. And though sometimes she looked a bit lost and afraid, that was simply a cue for Edelgard to grab her hands and bring her back to reality. Any conversation that they might have had was lost in the sound of the music, as they danced away the night in drunken bliss. Or at least, that was what she hoped would happen. As Edelgard danced, she found herself joined by the company of a man with a bushy beard and well-defined muscles bumping into her far too many times to be coincidental. Though she didn't really mind as he grabbed her hand at first and the two danced together, soon he became uncomfortably close. Too close. It was only a few minutes before Edelgard soon found herself looking for her friends and a way out, searching the crowd for hints of either Dorothea or Ingrid. "What's your name, beautiful?" asked the guy during a lull in the music. "Laura," she lied without missing a breath. "Well, Laura, care for another dance, or is it getting a bit hot in here?" "Hot?" Edelgard asked innocently. "You know, if you want to take a step outside and—" "Oh." Her face turned red. She was no stranger to being hit on, but most of her friends called her clueless when it came to figuring out when exactly she was being hit on. At that moment, she looked very much like a deer in the headlights before she was able to regain her composure and figure out what to do. Sure, the man was attractive in a conventional sense, but she had just been dancing with him, not trying to leave the club with him. Her face burned red with embarrassment, and before she could muster up a gentle rejection, the man put his hand on her waist. "You should smile more," he said. "You would look great smiling." "I appreciate it, but no thanks," she said, her face turning sour. "It was nice meeting you." "Oh come on baby," he said, brushing his hand a bit too low for her liking. "It's too early to stop now. Ease up a little." She grabbed his wrist in the most ironclad grip she could muster, strong enough to resist any effort to move it yet light enough not to crush his hand. His eyes widened, as he struggled to worm his way free. It was at that moment that he realized that she was not simply a woman for him to bring home and conquer, but something else entirely. Edelgard Eisner was more than just a pretty face. She would be the last thing he ever saw if he didn't keep his hands to himself. "I think I'm good, thank you." She gave him the hardest glare she could muster, as he squirmed in his grasp. "Now if you'll excuse me." She let go of him and pushed him back into the crowd to continue dancing. Soon the man with the bushy beard and the overeager hands vanished, and she began to relax and dance again to the rhythm. It wasn't long before Edelgard bumped into Dorothea onto the dance floor, and the two began singing the lyrics to the dance music playing as they danced in a whirlwind of feet and hips. Ingrid was not too far behind, and for the first time since the bar the three women danced together in unison. They weren't very synchronized, in no small part due to Edelgard, but it was the effort that made her smile. The fact that she was enjoying herself clubbing it all was a testament to their friendship. And it had taken 5 years for a bit of her mask to crack and for her to reveal a bit about herself. Though she doubted she would ever reveal the truth about who she really was, she had to admit it felt good to confide about her true feelings to her friends even if they were just friends. This was who Edelgard Eisner really was, though she masqueraded as a socialite to gain access to information she would not otherwise have. She also did so in order to keep her friends. She enjoyed their presence in a different way than when she was with her Black Eagles. She was simply happy being with them. If that was true, then the Eisner name wasn't really a mask at all. It was a reflection of who she would be if she did not have the weight of tragedy and vengeance weighing her down. If the world were just, she might be here with Dima and some of his friends, dancing away the night. Without her friends, she might have been simply a specter of vengeance with no compassion. But at least they made sure that she remained human. Edelgard was just about to try and hit the high note to the song's chorus when she heard the scream. It was low-pitched yet blood-curdling, and was certainly not a song she expected to hear in the middle of Mara. It jolted her out of her dance abruptly, and she froze in the middle of the dance floor. What was that? Was I just imagining things? Her eyes scanned the floor, not seeing anything out of the ordinary or any reaction whatsoever from the rest of the crowd. It could be just my imagination, she thought. But there was also the fact that every hair on her body stood straight up, which was certainly not a good omen. Something was very wrong. Ingrid noticed too, because she stopped dancing as well and grabbed Edelgard's wrist. "What's wrong?" she shouted, frowning. Part of her message was lost among the loud bass and the shouting of the crowd, but her lips told the truth of the message. "Did you hear that scream?" Edelgard shouted. "What scream?" Ingrid asked, confused. "The loud one. Just now." "Are you drunk?" she said, worried. "Do we need to take you home?" "No. I swear." She might have been crazy, but the scream just sounded so real. It reminded her of the screams of the test subjects as they were strapped to the table, and the doctors. No, she shouldn't think about that. Edelgard knew what a cry for help was, but this was something else entirely. That was the scream of a dying man. It was probably due to her enhanced senses that she was able to hear it among the shouting and the thumping of the music. She was just too well trained to not respond to an alert, and even if the faintest trace of danger presented itself, she would trade the mask of a socialite enjoying her night off for the mask of a survivor. She was just about to start convincing her friend that she wasn't crazy or drunk when she heard another one. This one was much more high-pitched female, probably. Then the scream turned into more, and somewhere near the entrance she heard the clank of metal boots along with the thundering footsteps of people fleeing. Something had gone very wrong, and Ingrid felt her tense up and pulled her hand away. "Is everything okay?" asked Dorothea, who had managed to squeeze her way towards the two of them. "Something's wrong," said Edelgard. "I heard screaming from the entrance." "Screaming? But..." Someone yelled out something incomprehensible over the music, and with that the club grinded to a halt. The synths and the bass came abruptly to a stop with the sound of a record scratching, and the lights flickered on to reveal a floor filled with confused partygoers. Not used to being in the light, some covered their eyes with their hand at the blinding lights, while others struggled to adjust to being in a normal environment after a night of constant drinking and smoking. "We need to go," said Edelgard. "Where?" replied Dorothea. Everyone's heading toward the entrance, as the crowd screamed and shoved toward the hallway where they had come from. Enforcers did their best to keep the panic from spreading, hitting anyone with a baton who dared rush them too fast. If not handled properly, it would be a stampede which would certainly kill more people than whatever was happening now. The screaming came from the hallway, she muttered. "Is there a back exit?" Dorothea's eyes widened. "We can use the stage exit." "Stage exit?" Ingrid raised an eyebrow at that. "I performed here once. We can leave out the back." "All right, let's go." Edelgard grabbed her friends and began to pull them toward the stage where the DJ had been just a few minutes ago. But before she had the opportunity to exit the room and leave the club behind her, she realized that the crowd was rushing toward them. This was now a stampede. Whatever enforcers had been there were either swallowed by the crowd, or they had ostensibly gone to deal with the threat. They rushed back to the dance floor, desperately searching for an exit and stumbling over one another in the process. Those who were unlucky were stepped on as they fell to the floor in a drunken stupor, though to her relief there were those who stayed behind and helped them up. Like water around a rock, they avoided the three women in the center of the floor, as the three struggled to understand what was happening. "Oh my goddess, we need to get out of here," a girl shrieked. "Is there an exit?" a man asked, blood on his shirt. Never mind that. Call the dem enforcers, someone else yelled. What the fuck was that? A girl screamed, as Edelgard followed her line of sight toward the hallway and the problem which they were all running from. An enforcer's body fell to the floor, blood and sinew falling out of where his gut had been in an unceremonious heap of clothes. 3 more drew their blades and rushed to the entrance where the enforcer had come from. It only took a moment before all 3 dropped to the floor, cleanly decapitated in a single stroke. She heard the clanging of boots once again, as the coat-check girl who had been at the entrance screamed for her life and ran towards the crowd. Her blood stopped at the sight of a man in jet-black knight armor, dripping with blood from his gauntlets. Despite the din of the crowd, she could hear the hiss of pneumatics and actuators as he slowly stepped into the room with menace. In both of his hands was a massive heated scythe, jet black from handle to blade apart from the glowing red line that marked a heat-treated weapon. His mask was a grotesque black one, with demonic horns that curled to a point and terrifying teeth that gave him the expression of a grimace. The Death Knight was here. And in his wake he left a trail of bodies, which Edelgard would most certainly join if she stayed. Panic gripped her, remembering her last fight with the man, or demon, in the tunnels of Abyss. It took a lot for her to be afraid, but in the moment she was strictly terrified. Fuck, Edelgard breathed shakily. We need to go now. What? Dorothea and Ingrid turned to where she was looking, and their faces turned white. No, he's just a myth. An urban legend. Dorothea trembled. No, Ingrid said grimly. Glenn ran into him. Edelgard shivered at that memory, but she managed to keep her composure around her friends. Doesn't matter, Edelgard said. Let's go. Ingrid grabbed her hand as she turned to leave, and Edelgard whirled around in a panic. No, Ingrid declared. We're the only thing standing between this club and a massacre. Her face had a grim resolve on it, as if she had already made up her mind. Was she absolutely crazy? Though she might have been a good duelist, she could never beat someone like the Death Knight, a trained killing machine. She had never even killed anybody, how could she? She looked away from her friend and at the Death Knight, who was walking slowly toward the crowd and cutting down anybody in his way. The club echoed with screams and frantic cries for help, as people rushed the stage and searched for any possible escape from the specter of death that approached. But her mind tuned that out, as all she could hear was the loud metal clunk of his boots and the beating of her own heart. He had to have been no more than a few dozen feet away, and he surely was taking his sweet time. Like lambs to the slaughter. Is there truly no one worthy of my time? His voice was guttural and spine-chilling, masked by a voice modulator of some sorts. Just hearing it sent a chill down her spine. You'll die, shouted Edelgard. You can't beat the Death Knight. No, Ingrid muttered. But I can at least buy you guys time. Stop trying to play hero dash. I'm not. Ingrid yelled. But if we don't do anything, these people will die. Ingrid was a stubborn bastard. A brave, beautiful, stubborn bastard. She considered the fact that her friend would surely die in the process, and only then did she truly understand what she had meant before at the bar. Ingrid was terrified of failure. She feared failing as a wife, as a duelist, as a Galatea. But if she died a hero, if she died with a smile on her face knowing that she had made a difference in the world, then she hadn't really failed at all. Then we'll fight him together, Edelgard declared grimly. You can't do dash. There's no time. Edelgard shouted. We're all staying, said Dorothea. Her face was white with terror, but she mustered the courage to stand with her friends and thus retained most of her composure. It was something that she greatly respected. Though Dorothea had dabbled in a bit of swordplay in her time at college, she had never been the greatest duelist. For her to give up on her dreams and declare that she was standing by their side until the very end, well, it was stupid. Edelgard couldn't let her do that. But it was why Dorothea was Dorothea, and it was why she loved her friend so much. No. Ingrid said. You can't. Fight? Fuck off, she snapped. I can't let you guys die like that. Edelgard grabbed Dorothea by the shoulder and pulled her close. Get these people out of here, she said. You're the only one who can lead them to the exit and keep order. But dash. Please, Edelgard whispered solemnly. We'll come back. I promise. Edelgard, I dash, go. She practically shoved Dorothea toward the stage, as the singer stumbled and tried desperately to get the attention of the mob of men and women before her. It was a monumental task, but she had faith that the Jewel of Newfoundland could get them to safety. After all, the alternative was a bloody massacre. In front of them, the Death Knight continued his approach, now no more than a few feet outside of striking range. Whatever resistance he had encountered was now nothing more than a pile of corpses. Those that were still on the dance floor ran for their lives, as he cut down two women that had to be younger than her with no more than a simple flick of his scythe. They crumpled before his blade, resulting in horrified shrieks and screams, and metallic laughter from the knight himself. Ingrid was right. The only thing standing between the Death Knight and the frantic crowd behind them were two of the best damned duelists in Fodlan. No armor, no hollow shields, just a fight to the death. But unlike her previous duel in the abyss, she would no longer honor him with a fair fight. It was a battle for survival and she would win. "Ready," she said, sneaking a glance at her friend beside her. "No," Ingrid admitted. "But I'm no longer afraid." She brushed a stray lock out of her eyes, and Ingrid Brandel Galatea moved into a fighting stance. If there was one thing she knew Ingrid was capable of, it was making a sacrifice for the sake of her friends and the innocent. It was admirable quality, but one day it was going to get her killed. Perhaps today was that day. The Death Knight glared at the two of them, amused. "Little heroines. Come to play. On my Signa dash." Ingrid rushed forward without waiting, and it was at that moment that Edelgard wondered if the Queen of Flames in her revolution would die with her tonight. But if she was going to die, at least she would go out fighting, and maybe then she would be the hero that she had always dreamed of being. Chapter 23, Reach for my hand. "Ingrid! You can't just dive in with no plan," Edelgard yelled. Of course Ingrid was running in with no plan. An outside observer might surmise that diving headfirst into a fight against a merciless killer was tantamount to suicide. And even if she was probably the best lance duelist in the system, she was completely unarmed against an opponent in mechanized armor and a heated blade. She was not exactly known for her wrestling skills, either. It was only natural that Edelgard ran right after her. But her delayed reaction meant that Ingrid was still a few feet in front of her, though she was able to get up to speed much faster with an explosive burst of speed from her legs. Seeing their approach, the Death Knight merely stood there, clad in the black armor that signified his ruthlessness and brutality. He did not move, or at least she could not tell beneath the mask. Holding his scythe in both hands, he merely braced himself for impact, or to cleave the two women in two, whichever came first. Everything about the battle screamed run. Here she was, taking on the Death Knight, who had previously bested her in the tunnels of Abyss while she was wielding her hallocks. Now with half the preparation, and only the support of a feisty lancer, she still ran in to confront him. Her mind told her to cut her losses and to leave Ingrid to her own foolishness. But her heart couldn't take that. If she left her friends to die while the Queen of Flames ran to live another day, she could not live with herself. She was no hero, that much was certain. But if Edelgard abandoned her friends to pursue her ideals, then she truly did have the cold heart of a mercenary. And so she stayed. The floor itself was covered in broken glass, liquid that was far too red to be just alcohol, and the bodies of those who were either too slow or too drunk. They had fallen alongside the enforcers and bouncers who had given their lives in order for the people to escape. She certainly had no love for the enforcers, but at least they had died with honor. Edelgard felt something crunch beneath her dress shoes. If they were not already red with blood, they certainly would be now. It was all she could do to not grimace in disgust as she ran. Above them, sparks fell and lights flickered from the partially destroyed light system. The room was covered in an eerie yellow glow from the main lights, while the rest of the room was covered in darkness. Somehow the Death Knight had gotten to the power subsystem and shut off most of the main power, with only the auxiliary backup serving to keep the club's systems online. There was no thumping bass or high-pitched notes, only the screams of the living and the moans of the dying. There had to be still a few dozen people left on the dance floor, those who could not move, or those who stayed with them in their last moments. They were far enough away from the Death Knight that they were going to be all right, but it was clear to Edelgard that her and Ingrid were the only thing standing in his way. But she could not reach Ingrid in time before she was in range of the Death Knight's scythe, and with that realization, a cold knife twisted into her heart. Would her friend die here? She had sworn to protect the people of Newfoundland, and now she was letting her friend run into battle with the closest thing to a boogeyman this world had. She cursed her own inaction. Ingrid, she screamed. The first move of the battle was Ingrid's. The second she came within striking distance, the Death Knight brought the scythe in a large horizontal sweep toward her head. She quickly dropped her body to the ground in a deep slide, leading with her right foot, shifting her body slightly right and bringing her head barely below the scythe. Her momentum carried Ingrid far enough that she slid past him, and though he brought his scythe in an arc to finish the strike, he was unable to connect with her in time. Edelgard suppressed her sigh of relief. In the process, she grabbed a sword from the corpse of an enforcer and leapt to her feet. Ingrid took up a position behind the Death Knight with her sword held steadily in both hands in front of her, holding her body at an angle but with the edge of the blade pointing toward her assailant. Edelgard, not one to be outdone, took up her own stance several meters in front of the Death Knight. Though she did not have the luxury of a sword or a hallux, she ripped the part of her dress that concealed the hidden vibroblade on her person. She grabbed the handle in her left hand, tossing it up in the air and snatching it out in an underhand grip with her right hand. Such theatrics were certainly not necessary, but a good knife trick worked wonders for confidence. Edelgard brought her hands to neck level, one hand clutching her knife so hard her knuckles were white and another blocking her face. Years of training with a blade returned to her in an instant. Though she had been raised a noble scion in the way of an axe, Hubert had taught her how to kill with a knife. She thanked her lucky stars that neither of them were in heels. If they were, they would have already been dead. Regardless, they were not very far from being dead if the Death Knight wished so. Neither were carrying their preferred weapons. Ingrid was using the weapon of her fiancé, though from their spars in college she certainly was no slouch with the sword. And Edelgard's skills with a knife might have been good, but they removed the biggest advantage, that she had her strength. The small blade meant that she lacked the leverage to truly push back against the Death Knight's scythe if push came to shove. Though it was 2 against 1, they were firmly at a disadvantage. The glance that the two shared as their eyes made contact confirmed one thing: they were there to stall for time. The sound of footsteps and people fleeing out the back meant that their plan was working for now. She only prayed that Dorothea was having success helping them out of Maru. And if that success meant putting the lives of 2 somewhat remarkable socialites on the line, so be it. The Death Knight returned her gaze coldly, his red eyes remaining soulless just as it did in Abyss. Those eyes had haunted her nightmares ever since she was injured, and now was an opportunity to pay it back with interest. She did not or could not kill him as he was. But she sure as hell could give him a good fight. Edelgard moved quickly, bringing her dagger towards his chest as she sidestepped the scythe coming down before her. The Death Knight moved out of the way, before swinging it around in an arc to block an attack from Ingrid on his rear. It was lazy and slow, as if he didn't care much for the girl with a sword behind him. Unlike before, he now only had one hand on the scythe, giving him more reach but less leverage when push came to shove. Ingrid reacted by swinging her sword in a flurry of strikes, each aiming for specific joints on his armor. Those were supposedly the weak spots. Common doctrine provided that a swordsman aimed between the plates, not directly at their center. But the attacks were relatively ineffective, as the Death Knight blocked the ones that were close enough to do real damage with his plated gauntlet and dodged the other ones deftly. On her end, she was busy dodging the business end of his scythe and looking for an opening. If placed properly, her blade could easily penetrate his plate armor due to the vibrating properties of the weapon, but her small reach compared to his massive scythe meant that getting in close range would be an issue. She ducked a swing before barely dodging the follow-up pullback of his blade, the same attack that had gotten her in the side last time. Still, his defense was impeccable, and any time she moved in to take a swipe he brought his scythe around to keep her back. Strange, she thought as the heated blade barely caught her own in a flurry of sparks. He's slower than he was in the tunnel. Is he holding back? The disadvantage of a scythe was in its predictability. The shape of the scythe, especially its crescent blade, meant that the only attacks possible were large sweeping attacks. Sure, the back of the head could be used for the occasional jab, but even then it had little practicality. This resulted in a thoroughly telegraphed series of attacks, using both swipes and downward arcs in combination. The problem was that the Death Knight was crafty and very, very fast. He whirled his scythe around as if it were a staff and did not have a red-hot glowing blade attached to one end. And though both Edelgard and Ingrid were used to the fast unpredictability of dueling, the scythe posed a major problem because it was completely different than what they were used to. The combination of range and sweeping attacks that covered all sides made the two of them struggle, though she did spot a couple openings that she was hoping to exploit. If she could catch him off guard after he overcommitted, then it was possible. Ingrid lunged forward with her sword as he whirled around to bring his scythe on her. The air rippled from the heat of the blade, leaving a hazy arc of red behind as she barely dodged the attack and continued onwards with her strike. Though she barely managed to nick his breastplate with the tip of her borrowed sword, the gash it left in the middle slightly pierced the jewel-like structure in the middle of the armor. "Arg!" he shouted, stumbling backwards in pain and falling to one knee. Edelgard made a mental note of that and used that opportunity to strike. Though she had at first been aiming for the muscles that connected his right arm to the rest of his body, his thrashing meant that she only managed to drive her dagger into his shoulder pauldron all the way down to its hilt. She only felt the sickening squelch of metal cutting through flesh about halfway down, which meant that her attack had drawn blood but did not go deep enough to cause any meaningful damage. Still, the fact that he did not even react concerned her, as her opponent grabbed his scythe and switched to a two-handed grip. Ingrid moved in for another attack, but this time the Death Knight slammed the handle of his weapon onto the ground before either of them could get in another blow. Her eyes widened as from the hilt of the blade a massive energy shockwave blasted the two of them back, knocking her backwards and into the air. She flailed her arms for half a second before her left foot found purchase on the floor and she managed to steady herself with both her hands. Both her hands. She looked downwards to look for her dagger only to see the Death Knight rip the blade out of his shoulder with a synthesized growl. His calm expression was replaced with a fiery intensity in his artificial eyes, the jet-black teeth on his helmet snarling into a grimace. Now he walked toward her, the glowing scythe held in both hands, and Edelgard instinctively shivered. Her eyes wandered the floor to catch a glimpse of Ingrid, and found that her friend was not as lucky as she was. She lay on the floor groaning, her sword laying next to her as she struggled to get to her feet. Her efforts were in vain, because she made it halfway before collapsing once more. If the Death Knight got to her, then it was all over. Edelgard had to keep her opponent occupied. If not, Ingrid Brandel Galatea would die. With more speed than she had ever seen him display, her opponent dashed toward her before she had time to scan the environment for a weapon. His scythe scorched the air around her, barely missing her head by an inch and singing the hair on her left cheek. She deftly dodged out of the way, leaping backwards a meter or so before surveying her surroundings once more. Her eyes flickered from the Death Knight before her to the bodies on the ground, identifying a bloodied sword lying on the ground a few meters to her right. It was half broken and still glowing with energy, but it would do. She did not have time to figure out how she would get to it, as the masked knight swung his scythe down in a wide arc and then followed up with a sweep near her legs. She yelped and tumbled to her right, vaulting herself toward the dead enforcer on the ground and grabbing his sword with her right hand. The Death Knight was not far behind, though he resumed his steady approach from before with scythe in hand. Her grip tightened on it, and with some help from her left arm she pushed herself to her feet and forced herself to face her opponent head-on. The blade felt unnatural in her hands as she shifted her fingers slightly. Though she had practiced with a sword before, going through the basic motions of parrying and lunging, it still felt strange. It did not have the heft an axe did, nor the sheer mobility that a knife offered. But her half-broken blade would have to do, because it was the only thing standing between the Death Knight and Ingrid. With horror, she realized that he had been holding back before, toying with the two women who dared to fight. But now the Death Knight was done playing games, and the ferocity he displayed only served to confirm her hypothesis. The gem in the center of his chest seemed to be the key here. Something about it caused him immeasurable amounts of pain, seeing that it had cracked from left to right in a jagged white edge. It glowed a violent purple, more so than it had before, perhaps some sort of compensation for the damage incurred earlier. If it was the power source of his suit, then if she broke it they would have a chance. She bit back a curse as the knight snapped her out of her analysis by taking a quick swing at her before spinning the scythe around. She caught it on its return strike with her own blade, deflecting it with a quick flick of her wrist and pushing it to the floor. It carved through the tile, shattering it into fragments that kicked up dust and left her an opening. Edelgard dived forward with her sword in a downward thrust, which the Death Knight deflected with his scythe. But what she had been planning on was his overcommitment to the parry, which meant that she could kick him squarely in the torso and send him staggering backwards. She felt the metal bend underneath her shoe from the force of the impact, though with it came bits and pieces of leather off of her foot. All it took was a swing of her blade to knock the scythe out of his hand and send it clattering to the floor. With a roar of defiance, she leapt up into the air and brought her blade behind her head with both hands, aiming to cleave the Death Knight in two as he struggled to regain his composure. Her sword crackled with energy as she reached the apex of her jump and began to crash down to earth, mustering every bit of energy into her attack. Her attack was stopped abruptly by a lightning-fast movement on the part of her opponent. Any downward momentum she had vanished, as Edelgard felt the cold touch of metal on her neck holding her still. A gauntleted hand was now wrapped around her throat in midair, holding her up as she kicked and struggled to no avail. She even tried to bring her sword down, before the Death Knight tightened his grip on her neck. Every joint and plate on his hand dug into the skin around her neck, choking her as her grip weakened around the sword. She did not even hear it fall to the floor as it fell out of her hands. Her arm fell to her side, hanging limply as she lacked the energy or the strength to fight. Her attack had failed. Overconfidence had gotten the better of her once again. Can't breathe. As the fingers tightened around her throat, she felt her airway constrict as she choked for air. Her vision began to blur, as the Death Knight lowered her slightly so that he could look into her eyes. It was odd how much the helmet, as limited in its motion as it was, could give the appearance of a sadistic smile. He simply held her with one hand and addressed her with the same bone-chilling voice as before. "You have quite the fight in you, little girl. But I am tired of playing with my prey." His grip closed fully, and the choking sounds that came from her own throat felt as if it were coming elsewhere. She felt so sleepy, so tired. Her vision went from blurry to dimming, and though she struggled with her hands and feet, pounding on his spiked gauntlets until her hands were bloody, nothing dissuaded the Death Knight. Edelgard did not even feel the spikes dig into her own skin, she only felt the cold embrace of death reach for her as the world faded around her. "I'm sorry. Ingrid, forgive me." She felt the sensation of being slammed to the ground by the Death Knight, before the grip relaxed. Her body writhed with pain, though her mind barely felt it. Somehow she had been dropped to the floor, though for what reason she did not know. There was a fog over her thoughts, as if everything was a million miles away. The only solace that she had was that she was now able to breathe. Air, Edelgard thought between gasps of the stale club air. Air. Give me air. Every breath she took felt better than any she had ever taken before, as she felt life work its way into her lungs and into her system. Her throat still hurt, but at least the damned Death Knight didn't have his filthy hands on her anymore. Her eyes widened at the sight of the man in black armor, though now his back was turned. Facing off against him was a bleeding and heavily panting Ingrid, blood now staining her blonde hair. She clutched her sword in both hands in a shaky grip, but her face was one of pure determination. "Ingrid." She opened her mouth to yell but nothing came out. She tried to get to her feet, but her body simply wasn't responding. The loss of circulation to her brain must have left her woozy, she realized dimly, and to her horror Edelgard realized that she could not get there in time. Her friend had stopped the Death Knight from choking her to death. And now she was about to put her life on the line once more. With much effort she managed to tighten and retighten her fists. They were covered in blood, her blood, dripping from the cuts on her hand. They did not hurt much, but the very sight of them sickened her regardless. And it would be a lot more than just her own blood on her hands if she did not get up right now. It was at least a comfort to know that the only sounds that she heard were from Ingrid and the Death Knight. Everyone else must have escaped, or at least that was the hope she had in her heart. She heard the clashing of blades, craning her neck to see what was happening. A light parry from Ingrid, followed by a series of strikes toward the Death Knight's torso. A swing of his scythe, sweeping her legs out from under her but dodged by a leap backwards. A renewed attack on her part, dashing forward and sidestepping a strike from the masked knight. Parried by the Death Knight's scythe, before switching to a more traditional fencing stance and stabbing at his vital organs. It looked like Ingrid was gaining the upper hand. From her blurred vision she saw the flash of steel, moving faster than she had ever seen her move before. Her strikes were quick and precise, and for a second Edelgard wondered if she had been holding out during her spars. No doubt Glenfrildarius must have taught her a few things when it came to swordsmanship, and she saw the classical style of the enforcers reflected in her strikes. But she also saw a careful hesitation to her attacks, one that came from her years as a lancer. The two-handed stance that she employed mixed both her training and her love for Glen together into a single style, parrying attacks and returning with relative ease. She counted 2 strikes on the Death Knight's armor. She could not see the damage incurred, but it must not have been very effective based on the fact that he did not seem capable of faltering. While the Death Knight remained stoic and silent as he twisted his scythe around in a manner she had never seen prior to her battle in the tunnels, Ingrid was panting and grimacing the more she fought. She was running out of time. And time was not a luxury that Ingrid had. All it took was a single misstep. She stepped too far forward on one of her attacks, overextending and leaning too far into her strike. And to Edelgard's horror, she could see exactly what was coming. The Death Knight avoided her slash by leaning sideways, the blade cutting a ragged edge into his chest plate. He dropped his scythe into his other hand, and with one swift strike he brought it downwards, catching his opponent off balance. Ingrid stumbled, blocking the attack with her blade, only for him to twirl the blade and bring it back up. A single flash of red marked the moment when the Death Knight brought his scythe upwards towards Ingrid. She barely managed to dodge it with her body, but what she did not anticipate was that her arm was still extended. And in one smooth motion he cleaved Ingrid's sword from her, taking her right hand along with it. "No!" Edelgard screamed, somehow finding her voice. Ingrid shrieked in pain, her sword and her hand falling to the ground in a puddle of blood. She fell backwards, clutching the stump where her sword hand used to be. Her face was racked with pain, as she stumbled backwards and away from the harbinger of death before her. The stump of a forearm she held was steaming, dripping with blood. Though most of the major blood loss had been stopped by cauterization as a result of the heated blade, whatever was left had been rendered unusable by the heat damage. But to her credit, even the loss of a hand would not stop her. She shouted in defiance, reaching to her side and grabbing the sword with her working left hand. It was all Ingrid could do to hold it towards her opponent, the blade shaking from the tremors that racked her body. Agonizingly Ingrid got to 2 feet. Somehow she still had the will to fight. Seeing her display of spirit, Edelgard pushed herself upwards, struggling to her feet. It was only then that the pain began to hit, from being asphyxiated and then slammed to the ground. Everything ached, and she fought the urge to lie down and die quietly. She cursed the limits of her body, as she pushed upwards in order to stand on her own 2 feet. Her vision was tinged with flecks of red, and she was seeing the world through a haze. "I'll kill you," she swore silently. "So help me, you will die 1,000 deaths for this." For Ingrid. Ingrid fought bravely. But she was not a lefty, and so her attacks were weak and predictable. It was only a few seconds before the Death Knight disarmed her, though this time her hand remained intact. With a laugh he kicked Ingrid squarely in her torso, forcing her backwards and slamming into the club wall behind her. Edelgard heard a crack, before complete silence. Her broken form lay slumped on the wall, still clutching her sword hand. Blood stained her blue dress, blooming like a crimson flower on its folds. Parts of her beautiful blonde hair were on the ground in tatters, probably from an earlier attack. Ingrid looked almost serene with her head slumped and her body tilting slightly to the side. Gone was the defiance that Ingrid had mustered to save her friend. The only thing left was stillness. Edelgard raged internally. She was seething with anger, enough to strangle the knight in front of her with her bare hands. With all the strength she could muster, she pushed herself up through broken glass and blood. She screamed with effort, stumbling to one knee as she slowly worked up the energy to get to her own 2 feet. The Death Knight moved toward Ingrid's broken body to finish her off. She wanted to yell to get his attention, pray for a distraction, leap up there and snap his neck, but she simply did not have the power to do so. But as he took one step forward, Edelgard saw something sail through the air and hit the knight squarely on the head. It shattered into 1,000 glass shards, cascading to the ground around her in a shower of violet liquid. He whirled around with anger and growled audibly. Wine dripped from his helmet and his metallic armor, and he began to make his way toward whoever was responsible. Edelgard craned her neck and twisted her body to follow his gaze. There was Dorothea Arnault in all of her beauty on the stage, panting. She clutched another bottle of wine in her hands, though her grip was unsteady and shaking. Like her friends she, too, was covered in blood, but it was certainly not her own. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and her usually perfectly styled hair was now completely undone and in a complete mess. But in spite of everything, Edelgard was quite certain that she had never been more beautiful than she was in that moment. "Don't fucking touch her!" Dorothea screamed at the top of her lungs. She hurled another bottle, and this time the Death Knight deftly moved out of the way. It shattered into 1,000 glass shards again, the dark liquid spilling onto the floor in rivers and trickles. "Foolish girl," he snarled, breaking out into a heavy run. Though with a large scythe in hand he could not sprint, it was still faster than any enforcer and would certainly outrun Dorothea. Dorothea fumbled in her dress and pulled out a small gun-like object with 2 prongs on the front. She quickly squeezed the trigger, and instantly the 2 prongs shot out and hit the Death Knight in the chest. She smelled ozone and heard a faint buzzing as the Death Knight paused momentarily, before continuing on his path towards the stage. Though her taser packed a punch, the only thing it could do was slow down the advancing Death Knight, and by time the armor was far too strong to pierce, and any electrical interference was most certainly nullified by the suit. She retracted the prongs and shot again, only for the Death Knight to grab the string and rip it from her gun. Her face was one of horror, seeing her taser shrugged off as a mere nuisance. For a moment she seemed consigned to despair until she locked eyes with Edelgard. Her lips curled into a slight smile, but it no longer had the warmth that she usually associated with her friend. Now, it was more of a sneer. The Death Knight approached the 2 of them, and she had a small window if she could just muster the strength. "There's more where that came from," she taunted. "So you can fuck right off." As the Death Knight approached, each footstep thundering through the empty dance floor, Edelgard felt the last vestiges of adrenaline in her body as she surged forward and tackled him by his feet. He had certainly not been expecting her to recover so quickly, and so she managed to knock him off balance and send the 2 tumbling to the ground. The sensation of skin brushing against armor chilled her to the bone as the 2 struggled. 2 reached for the blade in hand, but only one would come out victorious. Her opponent managed to recover first, bringing the scythe upwards, though she was able to avoid it by twisting her body. He wrenched her off by pushing her to the ground, as she rolled into a kneeling position. The Death Knight rose to his feet, clutching the scythe in his hands. Edelgard looked upwards to see the scythe come down on her chest, and she did the only thing that she could. She grabbed the scythe by its handle with both hands, forcing the Death Knight into a battle of strength. She was on one knee, using her other leg to brace against the ground and push with all her might. Her muscles tensed with effort as she pushed with all her might against the scythe that was coming down vertically on her chest. Sensing this, the Death Knight roared with effort as he pushed back with both of his hands bracing the handle. If she failed, the blade of the scythe would plunge directly into her chest. Edelgard was screaming too, as her knuckles were white from squeezing so tight and pushing. She heard the servos of his armor whirring as he pushed, while she tapped into every bit of strength she had left. Still, the Death Knight was winning. The leverage he had while standing was far greater than what she had standing down, along with the additional boost of his weight pushing down on the handle. Dimly she could notice a pair of footsteps, most likely Dorothea, though whether she was running towards or away from the 2 she did not know. "You have been holding back," he growled. "Just like in the tunnels." She did not dignify him with a response. Every bit of rage and anger was poured into her struggle. She certainly felt her mouth open, though she could not hear herself over the roaring in her ears. She pushed and pushed and pushed until she had no more to give, and yet the scythe inched ever closer. It dug into her chest right above her dress, and she screamed with pain as the sensation of burning coursed through her chest. It was about an inch deep so far, and seeing her injury the Death Knight pushed with even greater strength. It cut even deeper, and now the pain was beginning to sap her strength. With one last bit of effort and a weak grunt, she jerked the scythe sideways with an unexpected movement of her body, knocking the Death Knight off balance but also cutting a jagged edge through her own sternum. Still locked in his stance, he stumbled and lurched forward without any opposing force to push against. She took advantage of that to knee him squarely in the chest where the gem was. She felt it crack beneath the impact of her left foot, and so with all of her might she punched it with a right cross so hard the power source of his suit shattered. He roared in pain, and Edelgard used that opportunity to rip the scythe from his hands. He struggled a bit before it fell to the ground harmlessly a few feet away. Now the Death Knight was on his knees, and she was the one standing as she rose to her own 2 feet. She heard the sound of sparks and small little zaps from his suit, and a small whirring as the electrical systems in his suit died. Though the wound on her chest stung more than she could handle, Edelgard von Hresvelg was not one to let a little flesh wound stop her. With as much strength as she could muster, she slugged him square in the face. The metal buckled beneath the impact, and though the force certainly made her hand ache, she ignored it. Down he went, falling onto the floor with a massive thud, and so she leapt onto him, one knee planted firmly on his chest, and continued punching. The adrenaline and the rage that had carried her all this way kept her going. The sound of the hydraulics in the helmet shattering. The sensation of caving in his faceplate. The feeling of ripping off his helmet, servos, and all. A familiar face with long light blonde hair. Angular features with faded blue eyes. Hollow, broken laughter coming from twisted lips. A sadistic giggle coming from her own. The sickening crunch of a broken nose as she continued to punch. With horror, Edelgard realized that she knew who the Death Knight was underneath the mask, beneath all the blood and gore. "Jurat saw," she whispered. "You were out of line," Edelgard snapped. "Of all the brazen things to do, you dash." "I simply craved blood," Jurat saw purred. "Is that too much to ask?" The man before her went by many names. Jurat saw von Hrym. Emil von Bartels. Death Knight. And yet she knew that she was speaking to the man underneath the mask, though whatever sanity he had was on tenuous grounds. He held his skull-shaped helmet in both hands, cradling it as if it were a child. The rest of his armor was still on, though, each spike and ridge gleaming in the moonlight. The Flame Emperor and the Death Knight met a few miles from the monastery, after what had been a disastrous sortie for the latter. Only the quick intervention of Edelgard kept her classmates alive once Jurat saw began to move. And the worst part of it was, he wasn't supposed to be there at all. It was simple. Get Cirosa's corpse or whatever relic was in her coffin, scapegoat the Western Church in the process. And yet the Death Knight had the audacity to come traipsing in on his skeletal horse, slaughtering mages and soldiers like with that demmed scythe of his. Certainly Uncle No, Thales, had sent him to throw another wrench in her plans with his wild unpredictability. The sad part about the whole affair was that she truly wished to protect her classmates. Friends, if she could call them that. She put herself on the line to protect them, and it was only due to the professor's quick thinking that saved them all. The accursed sword of the Creator. If Thales had known all along, she would be the one capable of wielding it. Edelgard muttered dark thoughts to herself, massaging her forehead with her left hand. There were so many things that had gone wrong today. But at least one thing was under her control. Jurat saw. "I told you, that you were to cause as much trouble around Gareg Mach as possible." Her voice was carefully measured, though behind that restraint was a torrent of anger that struggled to be let free. "But I did not mean interfering with our plans. You have set us back more than you can ever fathom. And to think you would strike down your own students, those that you mentored, those that you dash." "I have no sympathy for the weak," Jurat saw said evenly. "They were in the way." "I should kill you right now," Edelgard growled, hand going to her axe. "Your master would not like that very much," he said, smiling. It was a terrifying smile, an unnatural curve to his lips that seemed more like a sign of derangement than happiness. "That was why you saved me all those years ago, did you not? To let the real me run loose." No matter how much she hated it, she was right. It was not mere coincidence that he had ended up here. And if Thales truly meant to achieve his goals, then the easiest way was to turn two of his puppets against each other to eliminate any threats. She had taken pity on Jurat saw Emil, as he once was, laying in the blood of his family. Normally such indiscretion was punishable by death, but as she learned the truth of what happened to the Bartels, she understood more of who the man really was. He cared so deeply for the people that he loved, and yet the world continued to hurt him. The end result was a complete disconnect from reality and an insatiable bloodthirst that manifested the day he plunged a sword into his father's stomach. It was, of course, the perfect opportunity for Edelgard and Hubert. A weapon that never complained, never showed mercy. This was the end result. They had christened him Juritsov von Hrym, and left him to hunt. She should not have been surprised that he had cut a bloody swath through the countryside and through abyss. But fruitful as his actions were for her own machinations, some part of her could not help but wonder if she had made the wrong choice. By giving the power to slaughter to this man, had she doomed the lives of innocent people simply to sate his appetite? Did the ends truly justify manipulating a killer into doing her bitter? For the umpteenth time that day, Edelgard did not have the answer to her own question. "Don't make me regret it," she spat. Edelgard cast the spell to warp back to her own dormitory, leaving the man to his own devices. That night, she dreamed of a certain fair-haired pious girl with faded blue eyes and a gentle expression, and wondered if she would ever forgive her for what she had done to her brother. There was something familiar about his facial features regardless of whatever her false memories told her. It reminded her of someone quite close to her heart. But in the moment, with the blood splattered across his face as red trickled from his nose, she did not care who it was. She only wished for him to die. Her fists came down again. Again. She felt muscle and bone crack as she continued pounding on his skull, the laughter coming from his mouth turning to a wheeze until finally there was only a quiet groaning. There was only one thing left to do, and so she continued punching once again. Again and again and again and... "Stop, Edelgard!" Dorothea screamed. She grabbed onto Edelgard's dress and yanked her away while her fist was still extended. "You're going to kill him." "So what?" she growled, whirling around with her fist raised. She was an inch away from Dorothea's face before Edelgard saw her eyes widen in terror. She paused in midair, her fist hovering dangerously close to her friend's face. Her body shook, as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. Her object of vengeance was right there, she could kill him for what he did to all those innocent people and to Ingrid. "Please," she pleaded. "Stop. Ingrid wouldn't want this." Her cheeks glimmered with tears, her green eyes heavy with sorrow as she stared at her friend. She couldn't keep this up. She couldn't. The anger in Edelgard's fist dissipated, and it was a couple of tense seconds before she finally lowered her hands. Dorothea stared at her in horror, and it was only now that she understood the gravity of what she had done. She had revealed her true nature. Not as the absent-minded young lady who drifted off into thought and enjoyed spending time with her friends, but as a ruthless killer. The one who would do anything to make her dream come true, who would let nothing stop her in her way. She was not Edelgard Eisner, no, this was the Queen of Flames revealing her true colors. And though her identity might have been still beneath a veneer of plausible deniability, Dorothea had seen the worst of her. "Edie?" Dorothea asked gently. She said nothing, as her shoulder slumped and her hands fell weakly to her side. Dorothea took that time to pull Edelgard into an embrace, letting her friend rest on her shoulder. Tears poured down her own face as she dissolved into racking sobs, letting the emotions that had been bottled up for so long come out. It had been years since she finally let her guard down and sobbed, undoing years of progress yet providing her with the much-needed catharsis of a good cry. Her sobs were muffled into Dorothea's shoulder, and for what seemed like an eternity the two simply sat there. Dorothea ran her fingers through Edelgard's hair in an attempt to calm her down. There were a few minutes of silence before her tears dried up. That, too, was broken by the sounds of light footsteps from the hallway. She did not even deign to look up. "Another failed experiment," intoned a synthesized voice. "Step away from the body." That voice was familiar. Her eyes widened as she turned her head around slowly. The black mask that covered their face. The azure eyes peeking out, the black hood, the armor the color of ash. There was no doubt about it. The Ashen Demon was here, of all places. But she couldn't just leave. "No," she said firmly. She did not think about the ramifications of seeing the Ashen Demon in the flesh for the second time, nor did she understand that if she did not move she was certainly dead. Edelgard merely wanted to kill him herself. "Then die," said the voice. But in spite of the menacing tone, the figure made no movement at all. Rather, they just stood there, waiting for Edelgard to move. She heard the sound of whispers beneath the mask and the crackle of static, before she heard the demon cry out in pain. They doubled over, nearly falling onto the floor, before she heard the telltale sound of an energy blade activating as the Ashen Demon straightened. "What?" There was a voice underneath. But then who was on the synthesizer? Edelgard. We have to go, Dorothea whispered. Please. Dorothea tugged her sideways, pulling her up and away from the body of the Death Knight. His black armor had been cracked in several places, and his helmet lay in a pile of crumpled metal and wires. His smug face was covered in blood and his nose was twisted at an odd angle, a fact that she took great satisfaction in. Still, the steady rise and fall of his breastplate meant that he continued to draw breath. But he killed Ingrid. She barely managed to gasp. Ingrid's, she's going to be all right, Dorothea said quietly. Please. Just go. Loud footsteps stormed the room, as she heard the sound of swords being drawn. Dorothea whirled around to see the source of the noise, momentarily lapsing in holding Edelgard up. Without the support of her friend, she collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Now her eyelids felt droopy, and Dorothea made sure to cradle her head so that it wouldn't hit the ground. She rested in the lap of her friend, in the warmth of Dorothea. So warm. So peaceful. No, Edie. Stay awake. But her voice was getting further and further away. Her eyelids closed out of her own volition. She just wanted to rest. A little rest never hurt anyone, did it? The voices grew more and more distant. She heard footsteps getting louder. The sound of metal being dragged across the floor rang through the room, a horrifying screech that filled her ears. There was chatter, frantic shouting, and yelling. I need a medevac at this location, stat. Priority code red. Fucking move it. Ingrid, talk to me. You said we'd see the mountains of Duskur together. You said we'd have our honeymoon in Costa del Sol, you promised. Please. Captain, she's still breathing. But her hand and spine. On whose authorization? Authorization code FE-8E7531. Lethal force is authorized if you do not comply. Acknowledged. Take his body. But so help me, goddess, if you even think. Adieu, Captain Frildarius. Clean the rest up. Edelgard. I will come for you. What the fuck happened? This was a massacre. By the goddess. He will hang for his crimes. I swear it. But the Ashen Demon. Damn the Ashen Demon. I'll make sure of it. Dorothea? Is she? I don't know. Just take my hand. It's going to be all right. He's gone. Just take it. Please. The voices rang out with startling clarity, though she could not make out who was who in her addled state. Though Edelgard certainly could open her eyes and take stock of the world around her, she simply wanted peace and quiet. She had made enough mistakes for today. It was to her horror that she found that the rest she so desired would never come. The adrenaline in her system must have kept her conscious against her will. She was vaguely aware of sirens and the sensation of being dragged upwards in a stretcher, but the sensation was dull and fleeting. The only thing Edelgard she could do was reach out her hand in a feeble attempt for some comfort, and as gentle fingers interlaced with her own she found peace for the first time that night. Chapter 24, Interlude, The Twin Jewels. When you said you made dinner plans, this was not exactly what I had in mind. Oh? And do you not like my company? You know full well that's not what I meant. Ferdinand von Aegir tapped his finger on the leather chair in front of him, annoyed. He was a simple man. He wanted to get his work done, and unwind with a bottle of wine in the arms of his beloved. But doing both at the same time was a ridiculous notion, and it took all of his goodwill to not pout like a petulant child. Hubert von Vestra rolled his eyes and returned to his paperwork, signing off on a few basic missives that he was a signatory for. It was his office, of course, that they had dinner in. Not that he did not prefer the offices of the enforcers, far from it. It was that it was simply more efficient for Ferdinand to come by after his shift than for Hubert to come by after his shift. The epithet of creepy vampire did not come without some truth. He usually worked the night shift, and it made little sense for them to meet at the start of Ferdinand's day. And so they found time where they could, which was usually in the evening. A fair compromise for men of their stature. You need to stop being a workaholic, complained Ferdinand. You know there's only 24 hours in a day. He shrugged. Deputy director is simply a title for a glorified secretary dealing in state secrets. You know the director leaves me all his dirty work to sort through. Can't it wait? Not if I like my head on my shoulders. Ridiculous, Ferdinand scoffed. I don't get half the work, and I'm the commissioner. As if you can call waving your sword around work, Hubert retorted. What's that supposed to mean? Ferdinand raised an eyebrow at that. The buzzer rang. Ah, good timing, Hubert drawled. Do come in. The door opened slightly. A young secretary with mousy brown hair awkwardly bowed in deference to the two, and brought two immaculate white plates filled with food through the doorway. It almost reminded him of Edelgard. She placed them in front of each of them, gently nudging Ferdinand out of the way as she reached over to give Hubert his. Thank you. Neela, was it? Yes, sir, she said, flushing. You're dismissed for the night. Go enjoy yourself. But sir, protocol demands dash. Bah, protocol, Hubert scoffed. If anyone asks, the deputy director asked you to go grocery shopping. No one's going to believe that, chuckled Ferdinand. Tell them that he ordered you to take his suits to the dry cleaners. Noted, muttered Hubert. That would be your cue to leave. Thank you, she squeaked out, before all but running out of the room. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Hubert to let out a long sigh. Awfully nice to the secretaries, aren't you? Teased Ferdinand, though there was a hint of accusation in his tone. They do not warrant mindless cruelty. They are here to serve me, and what good are servants if they do not wish to serve me? They work for you, not serve. Everyone serves someone, in one way or another. Except the God Emperor. Hubert sighed. Yes, except him. Need I remind you that I was once a retainer as well? Yes, said Ferdinand dismissively. I know. Good. We should eat before the food becomes cold. Thought you'd never ask. Ferdinand dug into his ribeye carefully with a knife and fork, in the proper way that nobility had been carefully trained to do. It was a habit that he could probably never break, even if he was in the company of a man who simply did not care for formalities anymore. While Hubert was still technically of noble lineage as part of House Vestra, he was long removed from the life of privilege that his siblings and parents enjoyed. He instead ate his rice with a spoon with haste so that he could return to his work as soon as possible. So, said Ferdinand, breaking the silence. Anything on your mind? Other than paperwork? I wish, Hubert replied. Sometimes I believe the director gives me these damned documents just to waste time. Do you think it's a waste of time, then? He paused, placing his spoon gingerly on his plate. It is a necessary evil. Necessary for what? Hubert scoffed. My goals, of course. You and your goals, Ferdinand muttered. Everyone wants to make Newfoundland better, and I don't think filling out papers is going to do that. You'd be surprised, Hubert divulged. Take this paper, for instance. He grabbed a sheet of paper off of the stack and showed it to Ferdinand. Recent developments in Ferdiad district have shown that despite the size of the enforcer garrison stationed there seems to be an increase in petty crime, gross misappropriation of resources, recommending a review of all enforcers stationed there for ties to external organizations, he read. Ah. The Ferdiad issue seems to be a bit worse than I thought. Interesting, isn't it? Suggested Hubert. All that money you pour into one of the richest districts, and yet it won't stop a petty purse snatching. I was not aware that it had gotten this bad. Mansur's report didn't include any of this. And that's why you read, Ferdinand, he chided. You can't always rely on your subordinates to report information to you in an accurate manner. The best way to absorb information is to read reports and analyses, and from that come to your own conclusions. Only then can you find an effective solution that does not take political grandstanding or self-serving tendencies into account. And I suppose this will better Newfoundland. Exactly. Hubert shoved a spoonful of rice into his mouth. And you want me to sign off on the proposal detailed below? One might even call you a clairvoyant with the amount of foresight you have. Figures, grumbled Ferdinand, putting the paper to the side after signing off with a few furious scribbles. One would think that you invited me to dinner just to sign this paper. It was on the docket, said Hubert casually. And here we go with the docket again, Ferdinand said while cutting a sizable chunk out of his ribeye. But speaking of said docket, what are the latest developments on our royalty problem? Ah, the Queen. Well, none of our intelligence has managed to come up with definitive proof of her identity. But there is a suspect list in the hundreds, and we do plan on going through each and every one. Do you think it's just the Red Bandit with a shiny coat of paint? No, we hung the Red Bandit from the gallows years ago, Hubert stated. Maybe we thought we hung the Red Bandit years ago. Oh. He tapped his chin apprehensively. A possibility. But in all fairness, I find her identity much less interesting than discerning her motives. Her motives? She seems to hate the magistrate. A hollow laugh echoed from Hubert. And what seems to have given you that impression, he said. Funny, replied Ferdinand unamused. Your sense of humor is getting worse by the day. All jokes aside, Hubert continued. For the last few years we have been aware of the existence of a Queen of Flames. But it's only been in the last month or so that she has come out into the open to move against us. All previous moves were done for monetary gain. Her Black Eagles seem to be proof of this. She seeks to create an organization capable of waging war against the magistrate and the empire. Even if she had unlimited resources, commented Ferdinand, I doubt she'd be able to match the full might of the empire in open battle. No, but that's certainly not her plan. Guerrilla tactics have been used in great success in the colonies of Almira and Brigid. Whatever victory we earn is Pyrrhic in nature, because they commit so little resources to besieging our forces for a disproportionate death toll. But unless you break the spirit of the empire, the occupation will never end. It amounts to nothing but a thorn in the side of our power. Still a spiky thorn, but a thorn nonetheless. And is that why Lonato worries the magistrate? Ferdinand pried. The governor, I mean. I suppose that having his garrison of loyal soldiers bolster the Queen of Flames and her Black Eagles would pose a significant threat. Nothing that an Imperial Legion or battalion can't handle. Still, if we were to squash the problem without incurring too many casualties. Then I am to understand that we don't want a repeat of Dusker. At the mention of the former colony turned wasteland, Hubert's mind seethed. Perhaps when he was younger he might have reacted adversely or had a panic attack, but years of careful training to keep his resolve meant that for now he held his ground. Still, though he hid it on the outside, on the inside Hubert von Vestra could not help but remember. He recalled the acrid smoke that wafted through the air, the stench of decaying bodies and rusted blood that filled his nostrils and made him want to puke. There was the young Dmitri, barely able to stand and propped up by his liege. And in his mind's eye, there stood the young lady that haunted his dreams. Edelgard. Since the dawn of time immaterial, or more accurately, since the days of the War of Liberation, House Vestra had served House Hresvelg. Though at first it had been a simple lord-vassal relationship, over the generations it had evolved into something more. It was one of mutual cooperation, combining their power for the greater good of both houses. In some cases, the bond was solidified with marriage or even children, though it was rare enough that a Vestra-Hresvelg marriage was one for the history books. The only role Hubert had until his adulthood was being retainer to one Edelgard von Hresvelg, who was 4 years his junior and acted like she was 4 years his senior instead. Whenever they met as children, Hubert could only describe her as annoyingly assertive. But slowly the young Hresvelg began to learn the meaning of tact and respect, and though she remained a precocious girl she was at least tolerable by his standards. After the incarceration of Ionius IX, Hubert had been pulled out of school to serve Edelgard full-time by his father, a split-second decision that had changed the course of his life forever. Now their lives would be linked for as long as they lived, a thought that was certainly not lost on the young Vestra. For a while, their relationship was tenuous. Edelgard was adamant in doing everything herself, without the need of the busybody that hovered over her. Hubert was firm in doing his duty as a Vestra, and making sure she did not fall over a balcony or drown in the river in an unfortunate tragedy. But slowly the ice between them broke down, perhaps in part due to the kindness shown by Edelgard's mother, and in part due to the little Dmitri who caused enough mayhem for the both of them. Did he love her? He pondered that question one day, and decided that he did, in a roundabout manner. It was not a little crush or love born of familial obligation, but instead it was something much more substantial. His love was the kind of undying loyalty that drove soldiers to die for one another. For Hubert, his mission was all that mattered. And his mission was making sure that Edelgard lived a long, happy life, regardless of his own well-being. Though he was assigned to guard the Bladdids with his life, that did not mean that his own was on pause. Publicly he was taught by the same private tutors as Edelgard and Dmitri, along with the other vassal of the family Didu. But in private, by the hand of his father he learned how to kill someone in cold blood and get away with it. He learned about identifying poisons and possible antidotes, the art of using a knife in close quarters combat, and the nature of intelligence work. For the Hresvelgs, the Vestras were their blade in the darkness. They would do anything to protect both families, and thus they were doomed to a life of subterfuge and solitude. A thankless job, but who else would do it? It was all the more ironic that all that training amounted to nothing. Because a few months after Hubert turned 18 and his first kill, the unthinkable happened. His principal was taken away from him. The last time he ever saw Edelgard was through the haze of a tranquilizer, watching as she was dragged away to where the goddess certainly did not dwell. It was a scene that haunted his dreams for many years after. Those piercing lavender eyes that she had were burned into his memories as a permanent reminder of his failure. They were the only thing he remembered of his charge. Her face had been lost deep within his memories long ago. Though he had been freed from the clutches of Duskur and given a new life by the magistrate, he was still a lost man. Certainly the Empire had given him a second chance after his failure both as a retainer and as a Vestra, but he did not know if that alone earned them his loyalty. Though he climbed through the ranks of intelligence rather quickly in spite of his youth, Hubert von Vestra soon discovered that his questions were only met with other questions. Any inquiry about the tragedy was shut down, and any search effort for his liege and her brother was stymied rather quickly. Even his own private inquiries were found and snuffed out, and Hubert had to admit that something quite suspicious was afoot. He had to know for certain whether or not Edelgard was dead. Because if he died without knowing, then he died a failure, regardless of the rank emblazoned on his uniform. And he would do anything to those ends. Hubert. He came back to reality. It certainly wasn't good that he was beginning to unravel, especially after the events of the last few weeks. If he could just hold it together for a bit longer. My apologies. He shook his head. I was lost in thought. No, that would be on me to apologize. Ferdinand bowed his head in return. I know what the tragedy of Duskur means to you. I shouldn't have brought it up so casually. He finished the last bit of food on his plate and pushed it to the side. Still, it irks me that the Duskurites got away, Ferdinand continued. I petitioned for reinforcements and the request was denied. Ferdinand We could have easily finished them off without a formal execution. But then the Queen of Flames showed up, and everything went to shit, if you would pardon the expression. I thought I would certainly be demoted for my failure, but no, the Viceroy just laughed. My own father. He just laughed and told me to not worry about it. Does it bother you that she got the better of you? Yes, Ferdinand said without hesitation. Well, that makes two of us, Hubert said. Although, some apologies are in order. What for? Now Ferdinand was confused. The identity of the Duskur leader was held under Class V authorization, he explained. It was only a couple days before the date of his proposed execution that I learned his name. Didu Molinaro, he said, recalling the name of the man that was to be executed and escaped under dubious circumstances. His brow furrowed. Does that mean anything to you? Most files related to the Hresvelg and Bladdid families have been sealed under similar orders, Hubert pointed out. But someone intimately familiar with both would recognize him as Didu of Duskur, vassal of the missing Dmitri Alexander Bladdid. One would have to wonder how it was him that rose to the rank of leader of the Duskur expatriates in Newfoundland. Vassal of Dmitri Alexander Bladdid, Ferdinand paled. You knew him? Yes. After living with him for years, I suppose I would. You should have told me that. It's not information I can simply disclose, despite sharing the same bed and all. Ferdinand grumbled a bit, but the point was made. The magistrate was not a monolithic entity, though it appeared as such to most of the citizens of the empire. It had many facets to it that did not often share information. And despite the deputy director of intelligence and the enforcer commissioner sharing a working dinner, There were protocols to be followed. Outwardly the term magistrate was synonymous with the administration that governed the entire empire, but the magistrate did not publicly deal with military or governmental affairs. It dealt mostly in enforcement, intelligence, and unknown to the general public, research. Hubert had a certain disdain for the last one, considering any request to actually see the fruits of their labor had been denied apart from their robotics division. At any rate, it was no small secret that information was compartmentalized and hidden at all levels. That had been one of the reasons for Hubert to climb the ranks to get at the secrets behind the tragedy of Duscur, and to search for his missing liege. But as he grew in rank, the secrets that he sought for eluded him at every turn. And in turn, the amount of secrets that he kept grew even to his beloved, who sat in front of him sluggishly finishing what little of the ribeye he was left. It pained him greatly to lie to Ferdinand von Aegir, but when he could divulge some truths he did so with pleasure. Regardless, Hubert continued, I did find it quite interesting that Dida was blamed for the tragedy. I myself thought that he was complicit, but I found no evidence to either affirm or deny that point. And the fact that he was not killed to tie up loose ends suggests quite a poor showing of intelligence on the part of the Hubert. Ferdinand said, looking over both shoulders. Be careful with your words. Nonsense, he said, waving him off. I did a bug sweep twice this afternoon. Whatever listening devices in this room would be disrupted by the Faraday field, anyway. The what? Never mind. That Dida lived at all is something quite perplexing. The last I saw of him was with a spear through his belly, left for dead as I was taken by Duscurites. The only difference between him and I was that the magistrate had the grace to save me from the perpetrators, while they left him to rot. Or perhaps they saved him anyway, he mused, and simply never told me. I can't believe you knew that guy. That's absurd. Oh, I hardly could believe it either until I saw the results of the DNA tests we performed using his blood. But any request I had to meet with him or wring any information using more crude methods was denied. Quite curious. Curious, indeed, Ferdinand replied. What do you think I could do in that situation? You could have someone else interrogate him on your behalf, he thought. Although certainly the higher-ups would find out soon enough and you would be on the chopping block. Or, you could interrogate his subordinates. The ones that you failed to catch. I fail to see how that's relevant. Hubert snorted. Yes, both fine ideas if I want to disappear tomorrow without a trace. At any rate, I needed answers. Answers that I could only get through unorthodox methods, like convincing your father that a public execution was a win-win situation. You did what? Ferdinand shouted, getting up and putting both hands on the table. Viceroy Ludwig von Aegir, Hubert said, drawing out the last syllable to emphasize the surname, is not a stupid man. He can be cruel and vindictive, but if it benefits him then he can be most agreeable. So I presented him with an alternative to simply executing the rogue Duscurite without any fanfare or purpose. Ferdinand slumped down in his seat. You and father are far too alike, he muttered. I hate it. Of course you hate it, he chided. If Dida was executed, then it was an overwhelming display of force that reinforced both of your positions. A nice feather in the cap of the enforcers, and of course another one under Viceroy Aegir's tenure. And if he was not, then perhaps I could capture him on my own and get the answers out that way. That's definitely not what you told my father, said Ferdinand, annoyed. No. I simply told him that it was a perfect way to draw out the Queen of Flames. And I lost. Ferdinand shouted, clenching his hand in a fist. I had the opportunity to capture her, but she beat me fair and square. And when my enforcers closed in, she slipped through the cracks and somehow brought down a helicopter. A goddess-damned helicopter. How do you think that makes me look? Unfortunate, but it was necessary, Hubert replied coldly. At least the Viceroy was quite gracious about it, considering the information we gleaned. Damn the information. But my honor dash. Honor was the only thing you lost that day. And give or take a few million for the helicopter, but you certainly aren't paying those credits. Who can really fault you for losing to the Queen of Flames, anyway? She's been running circles around you enforcers for years. It's almost like you want her to win, he grumbled. To win the war, some battles must be lost, Hubert offered. Besides, a band of Dusker mercenaries is nothing to be bothered over. Didu is without a doubt an intelligent man, but even then his people have mostly lost the will to fight. Without resources and manpower, what can he really do? You really shouldn't underestimate the people of Dusker, Ferdinand warned. It's a calculated risk. And after all that, what did you find out? That the Black Eagles are actively looking to expand, and we can certainly take the opportunity to insert one of our sleeper agents in. In addition, we've confirmed that she's certainly hacked our communication channels. That's not possible. The encryption dash. The encryption is most certainly susceptible, and regardless of whether or not it's a programming or a human issue, the problem still remains. Find a better one, Hubert commanded. And that's an order, Commissioner Aguirre. Fine, Director Vestra. The ice in Ferdinand's tone was clear. I follow my orders without hesitation, and I'm not told all of the details very often. But from my own partner Dash. For what it's worth, Ferdinand, Hubert said, his tone softening. I'm sorry. I would prefer not to keep you in the dark. But as we all know, you are a terrible actor. Ferdinand scoffed at that. I am not. Your drama grades show otherwise. But despite his aloof tone, the tension between the two of them had faded. It was a very real fear in the back of Hubert's mind that one of his machinations would lead to the end of their relationship. Though it was rocky at times, the connection that Hubert and Ferdinand shared was not a ploy or a trick on his part. It was real, one of the few real things in his life, beyond his loyalty to his vanished charge and his disdain for the Vestra name. Sometimes it felt preordained. They had just happened to meet at critical points in their career, and happened to cross paths enough to grab dinner and learn more about one another. But if he had to choose between his liege and his lover, then surely he would choose the former, no, the latter. He could not choose, but if he had to. Hubert sighed deeply and shook the confusing thoughts out of his head. I'd like to put an end to this Queen of Flames business as soon as possible. Certainly the drastic measures we have taken are not drastic enough. And as you know, I would much rather be spending time with you than cleaning up another of the magistrate's messes. If I could drag you away from your paperwork, then yes, that would be most agreeable. Good luck with that. Not to mention the whole Death Knight business. Ferdinand wrinkled his nose at that. Yes, a nasty affair as you would say. 16 dead, 10 of them my men. Captain Frildarius is investigating that as we speak. Frildarius? You don't know who the Frildarius family is? No, I do know. It's just, quite interesting. What exactly do you mean by that? Nothing. Ferdinand raised an eyebrow. Keeping secrets again, Hubert. None that matter. And besides, he said quietly, the matter of the Death Knight is beyond either of our stations. He's a murderer. What else do we need to know? I don't know. That's the problem. When Hubert von Vestra said that he didn't know, that was either a lie or a sign that something had gone very wrong. And when he wasn't lying, the latter was a bad omen. Ferdinand could certainly read the expression of quiet confusion on his face, and blanched in response. If the Deputy Director of Intelligence was not privy to that information, then it was a sign that higher powers were at play. Perhaps even he had a role to play in all this. Whatever. I'm sure my men have it handled, and there's nothing we can do about it. Oh, how I hate that phrase, Hubert muttered. Of course. You're a control freak. I am certainly not. Hubert insisted in a rare display of childish annoyance. Then what does that make you? A dashing, handsome commissioner who likes leaving things in the hands of his subordinates. Oh please. You delegate just as much as I do, which is not very much. And you really should let your subordinates breathe. I get better results that way. You and your results, Ferdinand harumphed. You know what, Hubert? I think I know what you need. What? You, my good friend, need a break. I think all this talk of business is really killing the mood. Good friend. Hubert chuckled at that. Yes, old habit, blah blah blah. You're way too tightly wound these days. One could imagine that I only keep your company to unwind, then. "Ah, so you admit it then?" Ferdinand crowed. "Very funny," Hubert grumbled. "What do you have in mind? What say you to cracking open the Perignon and retiring to your quarters for the night?" He was referring to the very expensive bottle of wine that Hubert had confiscated from a recent raid on a nobleman for attempted treason. For quite a while it simply sat on Hubert's shelf, meant to catch the eye of anybody that entered his office. And though he was paid quite comfortably for his position, it was still an expensive bottle by noble standards. To open it would represent quite the occasion, though it was not as if Hubert had anything to celebrate these days. Still, he had to admit that Ferdinand was right. He did spend too much time working. A little rest and relaxation certainly wouldn't hurt, he supposed. Although, as with anything in their relationship, it would certainly come with a few strings attached, the most pressing being the matter of the paperwork laying on his desk. A tempting proposal. Although, Hubert said with a wry smile, "I'll have to see if I can fit it on the docket for tonight, Commissioner Aguirre." Hubert. Chapter 25, A Truth Half Empty. The poking and prodding did not help Edelgard's mood in the slightest. They reminded her of the experiments in her past, especially as the needles broke her skin and the nurses changed her clothes from a tattered dress into a hospital gown. Too many bad memories threatened to surface, but at the moment Edelgard was nothing but calm. Too calm. She answered the questions with simple yes or no answers. "Do you exercise on the daily? Do you feel anything cold inside your body? Do you taste blood in your mouth?" They were asking them because she simply would not respond to anything else. Certainly she could think of the answers to questions about her medical history. Her cover story had been meticulously planned and ironed out. She was a sickly girl in childhood, which explained her lack of public schooling. She received an experimental treatment that partially cured her disease, blah blah blah. But Edelgard did not want to answer. It was almost as if she had completely shut down. The night passed by in a monotonous blur. She did her best to keep her mouth shut and not think about the events that had happened only a few hours earlier. Every time she thought of Ingrid, the bloodied and broken body that lay slumped against a club wall came to mind. It was a memory that made her want to vomit, and so she pushed the thoughts to the edge of her mind. She vaguely could recall the normally reassuring presence of Dorothea waiting outside. The poor girl was waiting in agony for the fate of her two best friends. One was crippled, and the other near catatonic. Edelgard did not respond to any of her friend's questions, nor did she even react to her comforting words. Her face remained stoic, carved out of unyielding marble. Inside the mind of Edelgard von Hresvelg, or Edelgard Eisner as the medical files put it, a war raged between her emotions and her logic. The emotional side of her had just lost a crucial battle. This was the little girl, the broken young woman who had been tortured by the magistrate and left to die. This was the one who cried in Mercedes's arms for months, who if left to her own devices would have pummeled the Death Knight until his body was no more than a pulp on the floor of Mara. She saw the world in brilliant colors of crimson and azure, love and hate, anger and happiness. But there was also the logical side of her, the one that meticulously planned out every action before taking it, who carefully crafted her double identity to perfection. This one could not stand losing the Queen of Flames, who would stop at nothing to see the world burn before her. Emotion, sentiment, heartbreak, all of those were distractions in the face of her true goal. People were means to an end and no more, if her cold calculus was to be believed. It was a delicate balance, more so than the superficial facades of the Queen of Flames and the socialite Edelgard Eisner. Left unchecked, her emotion would lead her to recklessness. She would be dead long before she got anywhere near the God Emperor. And yet if she did not temper her ruthlessness, then she was no better than the magistrate herself. What good was creating a better world if she damned herself in the process? Logic told her that if she had left Ingrid to die, then it would have been a clear victory on her behalf. The Death Knight did not matter to her. The death of innocents would have been an incentive for the magistrate to clean up their mess, a worthy distraction that would surely prove beneficial. And she could leverage the death of Ingrid to rally Glenn to her side, a powerful ally, considering he was a captain in the Enforcers. All she had to do was find the truth behind the Death Knight, and whisper sweet nothings of revenge into his ear, and he would be hers to command for as long as he lived. But how could Edelgard live with herself if she sacrificed her friends for her own ambitions? She might have benefited in the short term when it came to her campaign against the magistrate and the Empire, but was it possible for her to truly let go of her friendships? The truth was that she doubted it. No matter how much she betrayed others, used deceit to cover her own steps, she still cared too much for those that were important to her. They were weaknesses in the grand scheme of things, but they were also her reasons for living past revenge. Ingrid, no matter how much she kept from her, even if their friendship was purely superficial, she mattered to Edelgard. Without her, without any of the people that stood by her side, well, she was better off dead. These feelings had been boiling up inside her for years, only to come to a head now at the scene of the Death Knight's massacre. She had let her emotions get the better of her, choosing to stand with Ingrid, and letting pure rage control her. If she had just come up with a plan, strategically maneuvered herself into a better position, hell, if she had just stopped Ingrid from throwing her life away. She had paid the price. No, that was not quite right. Ingrid had paid most of it. Now she was either dead or crippled, and Edelgard had delivered the Death Knight straight into the Ashen Demon's hands. Now she was going to come under scrutiny both from the magistrate and from the hospital, for medical results that certainly did not match up with her records. Both sides had lost, which was why Edelgard's mind was at an impasse. The last time she had broken down like this was after Mercedes found her. She had cried and cried until there were no more tears left, leaving her a broken shell of a girl. After all, what more was there to lose? She had lost her entire family down to the branch families, her parents, brother, cousins, aunts, nephews. If there was even so much as a family pet remaining, she might have at least found some solace, but there was not. No loss, she assumed, could compare, and thus Edelgard comforted herself in that things could not get much worse. What she did not expect was that a loss was a loss, no matter what came before it. The pain of her past did nothing to blunt the edge of losing a loved one, or the pain of failure. It was that fear of losing the same that Ingrid had. Certainly Edelgard had lost today. Lost in her own thoughts, Edelgard would have to shoulder the burden alone. It was no wonder that she felt so detached from the world around her, and the various medical examinations being performed as they bandaged her wounds and scanned her with esoteric medical machinery. She no longer wanted to be Edelgard Eisner, or Edelgard von Hresvelg for that matter. If she could be reborn into a new life, she would. Be careful what you wish for. The thought popped into her head as if someone else was speaking in her mind. She decided to ignore it, because the alternative explanation that she was losing her mind was something she could not bear. Edelgard, she heard distantly in her head. Edelgard did not stir. Please, just talk to me, said the same voice. It came from right next to her, from the rosy lips of a certain songstress, no, singer, sitting beside her. I just want to know if you're okay. That's all. Could she really admit that she wasn't? I don't want to lose you. Edie. I need some time, Edelgard said coldly, returning to the real world for a brief second. There certainly was a part of her who wanted to open up and spill exactly what had been happening, what was going on both inside her own head and as the Queen of Flames, her past as a Hresvelg. But she could not. Edelgard was sick to death of lying to people, yet it was all she did. She needed to get away and leave, far from this madness, far from the friend that was lying half dead on the hospital bed and the other desperately trying to understand what was going on. She got up abruptly from the examination bed she was sitting on and exited the room, leaving a shocked Dorothea simply sitting there. There was not even a glance spared, barely an acknowledgement of her friend's existence. She just kept on walking. It was odd that she had no idea where she was. Certainly it was a hospital, and a well-staffed one, considering the amount of doctors and surgeons on call. She was not on the trauma floor, since her injuries were relatively minor compared to the other unlucky victims. Instead, she seemed to be in some sort of hallway with a series of examination rooms leading to a waiting room. Edelgard was certainly not in the mood to ask for directions, so she did the next best thing. She picked an unlocked room and laid down on the examination bed. It was probably futile, considering she had just left an examination room to go to another one. But this one was empty, and didn't have doctors and nurses walking in and out to take her blood pressure or ask her banal questions. In fact, Edelgard was lucky that the questions were mostly benign rather than curious. She doubted in her current state she could give any suitable answers. The room itself was painfully white, from the paint, to the decor, to the bland sheeting, down to the color of the file cabinets. It was the color of snow on a cold winter day, beautiful, pristine, yet utterly lacking in any remarkable quality. She closed her eyes and imagined that white stained with red splatters, blood smeared all over from ceiling to toe. She could recall the Death Knight and his pummeled face, the bodies he left in his wake, the blood that dripped from her own chest wound before it was bandaged. Somewhere, deep down in her mind, there was an urge to stain the plain walls crimson just as the Death Knight had done. What separated her from the Death Knight? Another one of the magistrate's experiments, she supposed, just as Edelgard von Hresvelg was. She certainly had the same bloodlust as he did in combat, sometimes even she found her sadism unsettling. And she certainly had the capability to kill. Perhaps it was just her purpose, she was here for vengeance, while the Death Knight sought no such thing. If she did not have a reason to fight, then perhaps she too might one day be consumed by the urge to draw blood. And because she had that purpose to protect her friends, and create a better world, that was the reason why she prevailed. Out of sheer stubbornness and sheer will, a trait to be admired, if her paw was to be believed. It was soon clear to Edelgard that her guilt was gnawing away at her too much for her to simply be laying down and ruminating about the past. Instead, she forcefully shut her eyes and tried to will herself to sleep. Edie. The voice was barely a whisper, coming from outside the door frame. Are you in there? Please be in there, the voice pleaded. A little part of her heart broke. Dorothea was always so kind and understanding, and even now in her darkest moment she still chose to comfort Edelgard. Ingrid at least had Glenn to watch over her, but Edelgard? She had no one tonight. And she certainly was not about to call Mercedes after how she had reacted to the Death Knight last time. No one except Dorothea. She must have been hurting on the inside too, because why else would she still be here? Admittedly, Edelgard might have gone home if their positions were reversed, and yet the star of Newfoundland was still here. For poor little Edelgard, she supposed. There was a deep sigh that came from her own mouth. She cursed herself for being so selfish. All the time spent ruminating on her mistakes, being caught between two different worlds, mattered little if she made herself blind to the suffering of her friends. There was no running away from this. It would not only make Edelgard Eisner a coward, but it would also make her a human unworthy of even the smallest amount of respect if she could not at least acknowledge Dorothea. Could she be honest? The door's unlocked, croaked Edelgard. The door gently opened, and she looked up to see a disheveled Dorothea. Her hair was a mess, makeup was smeared on her face, and her eyes were puffy from crying. There was an expression of relief that flitted across her face, before morphing into a much more sorrowful one. Somehow, despite all that, Dorothea Arnold was still breathtaking, and her heart did a little double take, perhaps one of the first signs of life in her stone-cold heart. I looked everywhere for you, Edie. The doctor said you hadn't left, she rambled, so I kept looking and looking until I thought there was no hope, until finally dash. Sorry, Edelgard said distantly. I didn't want you to worry. Oh, Edie, Dorothea replied with a sad smile. I should be the one apologizing. By this time Edelgard was sitting up on the examination bed, legs barely hanging off as she absent-mindedly kicked. Dorothea took the moment to slowly walk over and take a seat beside her, giving enough distance to maintain a modicum of respect, but close enough so that she could hear her breathing. The paper on the bed rustled as she adjusted her dress to make herself more comfortable. When you and Ingrid were fighting, she admitted, I felt hopeless. Even after all those people got out and my throat was hoarse from screaming, I was so scared to lose you too. You threw a bottle at the Death Knight, Edelgard dimly remembered. I wanted so badly to just go over there and punch him. And seeing Ingrid like that, and you laying on the floor, Dorothea sniffled. What kind of friend would I be if I just left you there to die? Dorothea, if you stayed you would have died as well. I was so useless, she cursed, a hint of anger seeping into her tone. All that time spent chasing glory and stardom, and I just felt so insignificant. Like all of it amounted to nothing if I couldn't keep my friends safe. She shook her head sadly. And then when I saw you going to town on the Death Knight, and I realized that there was someone underneath the helmet. Someone with a sibling, a father, a mother, and for some reason my heart just stopped. She wiped a tear off of her cheek, taking some of her makeup with it. Edelgard took a deep breath. She had been out of line. To Dorothea, civilian as she was, it must have looked nothing short of brutal. She spared a glance at her own hands. Her knuckles were wrapped in bandages, from the injuries she had sustained when punching the metal plates of the Death Knight's armor. They ached, but in the moment she had felt a sort of jubilation. It was the cathartic release of all the emotion she had kept bottled up, an outlet for her anger. But a fit of rage was not the sort of conduct befitting a young socialite, and certainly not one who held the lives of others in her hands. "I don't know what came over you, Edie, but it was like a switch flipped," she continued. "You were always so cold sometimes, but there was always a kindness in your actions. Maybe when you dueled there was a streak of competitiveness and I saw a bit of fire underneath, but there was never this. When I saw the smile on your face, it was as if it was someone else entirely." "It was always there," Edelgard admitted. "Nothing changed." "Then I was right," Dorothea muttered darkly. "All that time we spent as roommates and you never once talked about your past. I wondered what had made you so cold at first. But then I thought that everyone must have their reasons, just like I did. And so I left it be. But now, I don't like dwelling on the past. I'm sorry. I just can't." "No, please don't apologize," said Dorothea. "You don't have to tell me anything. But if you want to talk about it with someone, I'll always be here for you. I promise. More than anything else in the world." "Dorothea." "What? Do you really mean that?" Now, etched on the face of Dorothea Arnault, was a mask of grim determination. "Yes," Dorothea said firmly. "I swear it, in the name of the goddess and everything I hold dear." "Then give me some time for now." "But I'll make a promise of my own," Edelgard vowed. She looked into Dorothea's vivid green eyes and saw the same fierce determination she had reflected back at her. "One day, I will tell you everything. Not now, maybe not in a month, or even a year. But I will find the strength to do so. And that's a promise." Dorothea reached for Edelgard's hand and placed hers gently on top of it, laying both on the bed. There was a warmth to her friend while her own was icy cold. Her hand was a gentle reminder that it would truly be all right. "I couldn't stand to see Ingrid like that," Edelgard said softly. "I wanted so badly to kill him." "I did, too," she admitted. "But it's not right. Once you take a life, there's no going back. Killing a killer means the number of killers in the world remains the same," Edelgard recalled. "Professor Hanneman always used to say that. But killing many of them is a net positive in the world," was the unspoken statement. A cold judgment even by her own standards, but it was the truth. As the Queen of Flames knew, long before that, as Edelgard her hands were stained with blood. There was no hope for redemption in the path of blood. The only thing left to do was to take down as many of those stained by evil as possible. "Oh, Hanneman. I hope his luck with teaching is better than his love life," she said wistfully. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "Oh, you'll see. Ask Manuela next time we see her." Dorothea gave a small smile, but in the somber mood of the room it only seemed sad. "Huh." The silence in the room hung for a little while. But unlike in the past, the silence between the two of them was more comfortable. They had spent many nights just doing work in silence, afraid to speak or make a sound for fear of disturbing the other's concentration, but now they were closer than they ever had been. She heard the sound of Dorothea's breathing, as it slowed and calmed. She heard her own heartbeat, gently pulsing with a steady rhythm, though there was something odd to it. Edelgard filed that thought under the "things to check out" category in her head and just enjoyed the peace with her friend for a few moments before she returned to the more pressing matters at hand. "Tell me something, Dorothea. What is it?" She shifted her body to look at Edelgard. "Is Ingrid okay?" she asked. "Is she?" "She's in surgery," Dorothea said calmly. "I don't know much else." "Did you talk to Glenn?" "A little. He was so shaken up about the whole thing, I thought he would burst out into tears by the time we got to the hospital." She shook her head. "But I think Ingrid would have wanted him to stay calm." "Glenn seems like a good man," Edelgard remarked. "Him and Ingrid go hand in hand together, even though we've only met him a couple times. Should we be so lucky?" "Ah, he's not exactly my type," said Dorothea offhandedly. "But yes. To good men for us both." "And women?" Dorothea blushed. "That too." "Did you tell him what happened?" I told him part of what happened. That you and Ingrid were trying to buy time for them to arrive, and that was when you both were injured in the process. I didn't mention much about the Death Knight's injuries, though. Well, he certainly would put two and two together, Edelgard muttered. And when the masked person came, I thought for sure that we were as good as dead. But apparently they said some authorization code and then Glenn, well, he's the captain, but he was following their orders. Really? Well, he was cursing up a storm about jurisdiction on the ride to the hospital, so I just let him vent. I think, she said, pausing, that seeing your fiancé like that earns you a bit of emotion. Oh. She put a hand on her forehead in thought. Figures. I'm sure if you talk to him then you can figure out what else happened. Maybe he'll tell you something, since he definitely wasn't telling me. Why would he tell me and not you? Dorothea raised an eyebrow. I'm a public figure. I could leak it quite easily. But wouldn't not being a public figure mean that I could leak it without any fear of retribution? You have a point there, she noted. Right at that moment Dorothea's holodeck buzzed, and she reached for her wrist to answer the call. A single tap of the finger sufficed, and she put her hand to her ear. Glenn. Is there something wrong? She paused for a minute to hear his reply. Oh. She grimaced. Edelgard's blood turned cold. Had Ingrid was she? Oh, why? Dorothea asked quizzically. No, she said, while pointing at Edelgard. The gesture was unspoken. Did she or did she not want to speak with Glenn? Never in her life did she imagine willingly walking into an interrogation by an enforcer. Certainly not as the last scion of the Hresvelgs, or as a woman firmly entrenched in the dredges of high society, and if she was in that room as the Queen of Flames she was probably already dead. Every bit of her wanted to say no, and to run away from the hospital as fast as she could. But there was a sinking feeling that she could not avoid it. One way or another Glenn would get to the bottom of what had happened to his dear fiancée, and Edelgard would be the one under the microscope of the magistrate. It was either now, or later on in the future with the potential of being much worse. She sighed, and nodded her head. Dorothea argued for a bit, before throwing the captain a bone. Fine. She's in 303A. You can speak with her. And with that, she cut the call and turned once more to face Edelgard. Edelgard, she said firmly. I'm glad I met you. No matter what happens, even after tonight. I'll always be by your side. Though the night had been an arduous ordeal, Edelgard couldn't help but smile in spite of what had happened. She had been a shell of her former self, a broken girl who had lost it all and nearly lost it all again tonight. And yet, somehow, Dorothea had drawn her out. No truths were elucidated between the two of them, and in spite of that the two of them had become even closer. She would tell her everything, just as she promised. One day, when the time for the Queen of Flames was past, then just maybe. Thank you, she whispered. For being my friend. Don't mention it, she said. That's what roommates are for. To the very end. To the very end, Edelgard repeated hoarsely. Dorothea got up, and it was only then that Edelgard remembered that Dorothea's hand had been on top of her right hand all this time. She had gotten so used to the warmth and the comfort of having her friend by her side that she simply took it for granted. Dorothea took a step towards Edelgard, leaning over and planting a chaste kiss on her forehead before she could react or even recoil. Call me, said Dorothea. I want to make sure you're okay. Edelgard could not hide the blush on her cheeks. I will. Take care, Dorothea. The door opened and closed rather quickly, and with that Dorothea Arnold took her leave. There was the hint of a conversation from beyond the door. Some choice words were being exchanged, but it was over rather quickly. She heard the loud footsteps of Dorothea's heels echoing in the hallway for a moment before the doorknob turned and someone entered. Glengoven Frildarius stood in the hallway, dressed in the standard dark blue with white accents typical of an enforcer. On his chest gleamed several badges, the largest one being his rank of captain. Some of them were flecked with blood, probably fresh from the scene of the Death Knight's rampage. Some of it might have been Ingrid's. He walked in slowly, without the typical regal posturing that someone of his rank might have had. And his expression was one of weariness. There was no sadness, nor anger etched on his face. He had certainly been through a lot, just as they all had. Edelgard, he said. Glenn, she replied plainly. He moved to take a seat, though unlike Dorothea he did not have the gall to do so next to her. He instead pulled up the chair normally reserved for the doctor and gently sat down. Glenn let out a deep sigh. I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. Is Ingrid going to be okay? She got out before he could continue. The doctors said she would live, Glenn said abruptly. Though the damage to her spine, and well, her hand, he shook his head. They're in the process of reattaching it, but the nerve damage was pretty bad. When I saw it, She nodded sympathetically. For what it's worth, Glenn, I'm truly sorry. If we had just been earlier, he muttered. Everybody was preparing for the big operation tomorrow, and when the first call came we took too long to respond. I should have marshaled my men faster. I could have saved people. I could have saved her. Don't, Edelgard said gently. She looked down. There's no point wondering what you could have done. The only thing to do now is to hope that she's going to be okay. That's very kind of you, he admitted. But what about you? What about me? That was a reckless thing you two did. Had Ingrid been in a better state, I might have yelled at her for being so careless. But, he said while shaking his head, you saved the lives of many people today. Did we? You and I both know the answer to that, he said wryly. If not for your stalling, everyone in that club would have been cut down. I owe you a great debt. Truly. She nodded. Still, there remains quite a few questions about the whole thing. Considering the fact that the Ashen Demon took the Death Knight, we didn't even have the chance to interrogate him. To think that someone else higher in the magistrate was authorized to deal with him. He paused. Forgive my ramblings. I'm just confused as you are, I think. He raised an eyebrow. Unless you know something. What could she say? In fact, the more pressing question was, what did she know? Certainly she did not know much about the Ashen Demon or the Death Knight, and what the latter was doing in a Newfoundland nightclub. And what did the former want with the body of a merciless killer, if he was really an escaped magistrate experiment like she suspected? Had they been trying to retrieve him all along? She would need answers. Perhaps not from Glenn, but she would get to the bottom of this. And if she had to don the mask of the Queen of Flames to do so, then so be it. He whispered a name, she lied. Jurat saw. Edelgard recalled the distant memories of a past that had never been, and the conversation she had with the man underneath the skeletal visage of the Death Knight. Had she been friends with this Jurat saw? Or was she simply employing the services of a man who relished in killing both on and off the battlefield? He said, tapping the side of his head. Name doesn't ring a bell. That's all I have, she said meekly. It was a lie, but it was a partial truth masquerading as a lie. After all, she could not exactly explain how she knew his name, or whether or not it was actually his name at all. And by throwing a bone to Glenn, it would both serve to placate him and to perhaps shed some light on the nature of the Death Knight. No doubt he was itching at the thought of avenging the near-death of Ingrid, and it would give her a bit of satisfaction to see that monster suffer. Of course, she would benefit by having the enforcers breathe a little less down her neck if they were busy chasing that man. Did he say anything else? About what he was doing, or why he was there, or anything? No, just something about wanting a good fight. Monster, Glenn muttered under his breath. Well, thank you. I appreciate your cooperation, even if this isn't an official interrogation. It isn't. She blinked twice. No, it's a bit too informal to be. He straightened his hands and clasped them together in his lap. I know there's a badge on my chest in a shiny enforcer uniform, but I'm not here as a captain. I'm here as Ingrid's fiancé. And any friend of hers is a friend of mine too. So please, he pleaded, if there's anything else. She shook her head. I'm sorry. That's okay, Glenn said reassuringly. There was a hint of a smile on his lips before his expression grew stern. And as for you, he continued. The doctors said you suffered from a chest wound, bruising around the neck, several lacerations across the arms, and broken knuckles across both hands. Edelgard blinked. Had it really been that bad? She certainly recalled all of her injuries she had sustained in their fight, but she did not recall feeling pain after. Perhaps it was part of her temporary detachment from reality. Yet the doctors said they were healing remarkably fast. And Dorothea didn't say anything about you, but I know it was you who brought down the Death Knight in the end. Ingrid said you were a devil with an axe, but without one. Glenn paused. She sighed. This had been a long time coming. Normally she would have just gotten Mercedes to fudge the documents whenever she went in for checkups. But at an official hospital, she could afford no such favors. Certainly her medical history did not exactly match up with what was described, especially when it came to her strength. Sure, the explanation of her experimental treatment for her sickness granting her strength had precedent based on several other medical cases Mercedes had dug up. But it was a flimsy argument at best, and it definitely did not describe the rapid regeneration that the doctors had witnessed. Could she lie? She stared into Glenn's blue eyes for a poignant moment. Could she bear the weight on her soul of spinning another web of deceit, to protect her secret identity and to draw suspicion away? Or was there a better way? But, please, Glenn implored. For Ingrid's sake. She bristled slightly at that remark. I'm not going to take you in or anything. I just want to make sure that you're okay. She barely knew him, and yet he had the audacity to ask. Still, it couldn't hurt to be a bit generous with the information she let slip. Maybe not with a random enforcer, but with Ingrid's fiancé? Edelgard would not get a better chance to develop a rapport with Glenn. She sighed in defeat. Fine. I know that my medical history seems a bit off, she admitted. I don't have cybernetics, nor do I have nanite enhancements. That would be an easier explanation, I guess. I read through some of it, Glenn said. Your experimental treatment for the disease you had as a child. Still, it's the truth. Or at least, part of it is the truth. Part of it. He raised an eyebrow quizzically at that. She took a deep breath. Let's just say the treatment was a little more than experimental. There was a moment before Glenn realized what the young woman was implying. His eyes widened. They experimented on you. Yes, she said shakily. I did manage to escape. But my hair wasn't always this color. She gently tugged at a strand, frail and wispy as it was. Whatever I gained came at a cost. By the goddess, he muttered. Is that why you were so quiet with the doctors? Yeah, she lied. I just didn't want to go back. The needles, and the doctors poking and prodding. I would rather die. A partial lie. That was the course of action that she had decided on. She was certainly still afraid of needles, and Edelgard von Hresvelg had no intention of going back to her torturers in the name of science, as they put it. But there was no disease, and no treatment. That was the lie that she would sell, and for this to work she would have to sell it well. After all, every lie had a bit of truth to it. That was what made it a good lie, after all. And the dueling? How you met Ingrid? I had no intention of going anywhere with it, she replied. It was the only way I could vent my frustrations without putting people at risk. I just wanted to live a normal life, Edelgard said wistfully. And now? There was a pause, heavy with anticipation. The tension was thick enough to cut a knife through, and she braced herself for Glenn's next words. Who did this? He growled. I will do everything in my power to bring them to justice, I swear it. For your sake. I don't know, she said simply. But they're long dead and gone. What do you mean by that exactly? He asked. I've searched. If the magistrate couldn't find them, then could you? He balked at that statement. What he did not need to know was, of course the magistrate couldn't find them, because they simply didn't want to. After all, they were the ones responsible in the first place. Perhaps not. But still. That's why I wanted to keep quiet about this whole thing, she said. The more attention is drawn to me, the more likely I am to be captured and returned to them. She looked at Glenn with pleading eyes. Please. I don't want to go back. Edelgard had never been the greatest of actors. But she wasn't necessarily lying when she said that the thought of going back was enough to make her shiver with discomfort. The fear that she had was real. She leveraged that in her body language to convince the captain that she could not possibly be lying. Though there were still many holes in her story, it was a lot better than the prepared explanation she had rehearsed many years ago if the magistrate ever caught wind of her enhancements. And because Glenn himself had a personal link to her, it only made it easier. "So that's why you want me to keep quiet," he said with understanding. Glenn gave her a solemn nod. "In that case, then I'll have the doctors keep your record the way it is." Now it was her turn for her eyes to widen. She had expected Glenn to do nothing, and deal with the fallout later. But now he was actively covering up for her, who unknown to him was the Queen of Flames herself. She certainly did not deserve it. It was only because of her friendship with Ingrid that gave her said opportunity, and she felt a twinge of guilt in her heart. Glenn was a kind man, now she knew that for certain. How much could she take advantage of him before someone caught on, or her conscience got the better of her? Her words caught in her throat. Thank you. There's no need to thank me, I'm just doing the right thing. Until we get to the bottom of this, you have my word that I won't say a peep about this." "But," Glenn said, his voice turning a bit softer, "I'm sure Ingrid would want to make sure you're okay." Oh. There was certainly an "and" that came with that statement. "You're going to let me speak with your doctor?" Her blood turned cold. Mercedes. Certainly she would never betray her trust, just as she would never betray any one of her patients. But bringing the scrutiny of an enforcer down on her clinic, much less a captain, was spitting in the face of the care that she had shown. "I want to know if there are any side effects, and if there's anything I can do for you. And I'm sure," he continued, "that Ingrid would want to know as well. And it's a small price to pay for my confidence." She stayed silent. "Edelgard." "I'm sorry," she muttered. "It's a gracious offer. I would be silly not to accept it." "Good. Who is your doctor, anyway?" "Mercedes von Martys," Edelgard squeaked out, a bit higher pitched than she intended. "Merci." Glenn spat out, doing a double take. You know her or something?" she asked gently. Now it was Edelgard's turn to be thoroughly confused. She called her Merci, not this guy. What in the flames of Alel was going on? "Her and Annette went to school in Fhurdiad together," he explained. "I met her quite a few times." "Who's Annette?" He wrinkled his nose at that. "Annette Fantine Dominic." Name ring any bells? Dominic, where had she heard that name before? For some reason orange hair came to mind. No. Am I supposed to know her? If you and Ingrid have been attending the same social gatherings, then you've definitely met her. But whatever, he said, waving the issue off. You'll meet her soon enough. Right after you meet my little brother. A little brother? There was a twinge of sadness in her heart, the reminder that she once had one as well. Dimma. She remembered how she had initially found him an annoyance, to be no more than a step-sibling. And yet, over the years, there was a part of her that could not bear his absence. Somehow his mere presence had brightened up her life, and now that he was gone there was a hole in her heart where her little brother had been. There was nobody to dote on, nobody to admonish when they misbehaved, nobody to share ice cream they had raided from the pantry. And then there were also the 10 siblings from another life whose names seemed to elude her grasp. Yes, I'm sure Ingrid has mentioned him before. Of course not, Edelgard said. Oh boy, he said, wiping his forehead. I'll have to talk with her about this. Then his expression darkened, remembering that his fiancée was in the operating room. You're Ingrid's best friend. You should know about these things. Best friend, she spluttered in surprise. But I barely dash. See her? Yes, but I can hear you guys chatting all the time from the other room. Seriously, if you're not, then she definitely doesn't have one. You're good to her, Edelgard, he said softly. She really does care about your friendship with her. You help Ingrid keep being Ingrid. Her eyes were a little moist. Despite all that she had done, and after tonight, perhaps there was hope. She had real friendship both with Dorothea and Ingrid. The time she had spent with them both was real, perhaps even more real than her little rebellion against the Empire. In a better world, she would be living in peace alongside both of them, in a friendship that would span the ages. Ingrid really did care about her. Her little internal discussion from before was flawed. She could not sacrifice her friendship with her, because it was all that Edelgard had left. I don't know what to say, except, she pondered her next words carefully. I'm proud to be friends with your fiancé. And if she could truly live up to being the friend of Ingrid Brandel Galatea, then Edelgard wasn't completely doomed just yet. And as reckless and stupid as the two of you might have been tonight, Glenn continued, you saved Ingrid's life. I owe you a debt. No, we all do. Keeping quiet is the least I can do for you. Thank you, she whispered. I'm sorry for causing so much trouble. You and Ingrid are very alike in that sense, he said. Always causing trouble. He got up from the chair, pushing it back into the desk and brushing down his uniform in the process. Well then, it's been good talking to you. I hope that you get the answers that you want, Glenn said. Of course, Edelgard replied. Thank you for everything. And if I find anything. Oh, here's my contact info. They exchanged contact info with a tap of their holodecks together. You know, Edelgard, we could use a woman like you. Excuse me, she said. I meant in the enforcers. You could leverage that strength of yours. Protect people. Make a difference. He shrugged. You never know until you try it. The thought disgusted her at first. But she had certainly given it some thought. Could Edelgard, given enough time and resources, make a difference from within the system? Even if she had both, which was a steep task considering she was no longer a scion of a noble house, she doubted it was possible. The grip of the God Emperor was too tight, the magistrate was too set in their ways, and the people were too apathetic to care about anything other than events with high shock value. Maybe in a different future she had lent her blade to the cause of the enforcers, but now? There wasn't a snowball's chance in Alel she was doing that. I think if I want to keep a low profile that's the opposite of doing so, she shrugged. But maybe one day I'll consider it. Good, good. I'll send you a recruitment pamphlet in the mail, he said with a wry smile. She rolled her eyes at that. Take care, Edelgard. Likewise, she said as he was leaving. Ingrid. I hope she's all right. I pray that she will be. She has to be, Glenn confessed. I don't think I could take it if she wasn't. And with that, Captain Glenn Frildarius made his exit, opening and closing the door as unceremoniously as he had entered. She watched as the uniform disappeared, leaving nothing but the white room for her to ruminate in. There was certainly a lot to unpack after her conversation with Glenn. If he was even a little bit intelligent, then he surely would see that Edelgard's explanation of her augmentations was a bit too convenient. After all, why would they experiment on her and then somehow let one of their successful test subjects escape? It was a story with holes, and yet Edelgard remained convinced that it would work. It was not that Glenn did not believe her, surely he did, but he also understood that Edelgard was not ready to tell him the whole truth. But as long as what she did mention to him wasn't an outright lie, then he would certainly be satisfied. Ingrid might not take it as well, considering the topic of Edelgard's strength had come up many times in the past to no avail. But as long as Glenn was in debt to Edelgard in a figurative sense, considering she had just saved Ingrid's life, then he was in no position to question her story. Perhaps that same trust would be extended by the woman whose life she saved in the first place, and the testimony of the Saint of the Abyss might help even more. Of course, there was always the possibility that Glenn would spill under magistrate interrogation. But the truth was that her identity as Edelgard Eisner was tenuous at best. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots and figured out that she was the Queen of Flames. Or even worse, they could find that she was the supposedly dead scion of the Hresvelgs, only to incur the God Emperor's wrath once more. What she had done by telling the partial truth was buying crucial time for her and the Black Eagles. There was also the matter of an offhand remark Glenn had made earlier. He mentioned a big enforcer operation tomorrow, which since the night was beginning to turn to morning meant it would be in less than 24 hours. If it was enough to delay the response time to a massacre such as this one, then it was serious. As far as she understood, her intelligence did not turn up any pressing magistrate matters other than the issue of Lonato, and it was not as if they had located the hideout of the Black Eagles. This meant that it could only be one thing, and there was a very significant chance that it would mean the end of Governor Lonato if she did not act. Edelgard could not hide in her shell forever. As tempting as it was to stay in the room forever, hiding away from the world, then she was only being selfish. Her men knew Fodlan itself depended on what she did next. Despite what had happened tonight to her friends, she could not falter. She pulled up the phone on her holodeck and dialed for Dedu. There was a series of beeps. Then a groggy Dedu answered the phone. "Lady Edelgard. Do you know what time it is?" he muttered indignantly. "4 in the morning, old friend. We have a serious problem." "I suppose this is hardly the first time you have woken me up with your antics," he grumbled. Even as a young lady. She heard the sound of rustling over the audio channel, and some footsteps. "What is it?" Dedu asked. Edelgard paused deliberately to choose her words carefully, noting the flimsy door separating her from the rest of the hospital. "I think," she said, "the big man is planning to meet with our client tomorrow. Let our friends know. We'll meet 2 hours before sundown." He yawned deeply. "I see. Lonato is in trouble, and you wish for us to intercept." "Very well, Lady Desh." He stopped himself, considering she was not his liege by technicality anymore. "Edelgard. I will do as you wish." The call cut out from Dedu's side, and she was glad that Dedu's perception had not dulled over the years. If she was right on her hunch, then it would mean the beginning of open hostilities against the Empire. She would have to do her own intelligence gathering, reach out to her networks, and muster whatever forces she had to fight off the magistrate. She had plans for Governor Lonato, and it simply would not do if he died before any of those plans came to fruition. If she was able to deliver a devastating blow to the magistrate in the process, Edelgard practically salivated at that thought. For the sake of Ingrid and Dorothea, the Queen of Flames would succeed in her mission. And maybe, just maybe, if she did in fact win, then the visage of Edelgard Eisner would live to see another day. Check the description for the links to the author.